Chapter 426. The Silence of Finality. It was a new era for Luxembourg and its people. For the first time in a very long time, the small Grand Duchy, tucked quietly between Germany and France, had fallen, not by sword, nor by rifle, but by the ink of a pen. Gone were the days where peace and prosperity were safeguarded by carefully balancing the interests of neighboring powers. The old game of soft power diplomacy and political maneuvering was no longer viable. In its place stood the cold, hard logic of the modern age, an age ruled not by persuasion, but by force, by blood and iron. Marie Adelaide had understood this far more deeply than Bruno had initially realized. For a long time, he had believed she was infatuated with him merely for what he could offer her. And while it was true that the future of Luxembourg's sovereignty seemed to hinge on some imagined personal connection between them, her pursuit had always been more than political strategy. She had loved him, not for his status, not for his power, but for the man beneath the medals. And yet, when the time came, and the brigands threatened her gates, she did what any ruler would. She signed the treaty. The banners of the German Reich rose above Luxembourg City, and with them came occupation. Not in name, perhaps. She remained the Grand Duchess, just as the King of Bavaria held his title, but her power had dissolved. Actual authority was now in the hands of those who had marched in from the east. It took Bruno longer than he liked to admit, seeing the full scope of Marie's wager. She had bet her freedom, her people, and her heart on the hope that he would stand beside her. Not as a commander, not as a hero, but as a man. And instead, he had stood apart. In an ideal world, perhaps he could have accepted her affections. In another life, maybe even taken her as a consort. But this was not that world. This was a world defined by oaths and duty, where personal happiness was often the first casualty of service. Bruno had long since buried his own desires beneath the weight of obligation, to Heidi, to his children, to the Kaiser, to his people. What room was left for dreams? So why, then, did this choice haunt him more than any battlefield? It was not the rejection itself. He had committed worse acts in the name of duty. It was the way he had done it. Thoughtlessly, abruptly, with a kind of callous finality that belied the depth of Marie's feelings. He had assumed, like so many before him, that she was playing a game, that she would recover, that it didn't matter. But it did. Because unlike the opportunists or the naive princesses who had flirted with him for status or safety, Marie had offered him something exceedingly rare, a pure and sincere love. She had never demanded he leave his wife, never even asked for more than a piece of his heart. And in return, he had cut her off with the kind of surgical coldness usually reserved for field operations. Now, sitting on a stool at some tavern after the annexation ceremony had concluded, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He wasn't sure why the Kaiser had summoned him to Berlin for the formal signing. Perhaps to remind both Bruno and Marie of their place in the hierarchy, or perhaps to engineer some reconciliation that had clearly failed. Whatever the old monarch had hoped for, it hadn't come to pass. And so Bruno had done the only thing he could. He disappeared from the marble halls and gold-trimmed parlors and found himself in a quiet Berlin tavern, one he, Heinrich, and Erich had frequented in the early years. The walls were old wood. The stools were uneven. The beer was cheap and honest. He sat with a full-liter stein in front of him, untouched, staring at it like it might offer answers. He had fulfilled his promise to Marie. He had ensured her safety, even at the cost of her sovereignty. But at what cost to himself? To her? That was when he heard the voice. "Do you mind if I sit here?" It was soft, familiar, measured. He looked up, and there she was, Marie Adelaide. Not dressed like a monarch, not like a woman scorned. Just herself, regal still, but without artifice. He gestured to the seat opposite him. She took it slowly. For a moment, neither spoke. The bar's murmurs faded into a strange, distant silence. Then she broke it. "I've signed away everything," she said. "My crown, my power, my people's independence. All of it. And I did it with a full understanding of what it meant." Bruno nodded slightly. "You saved lives." "I ended a nation," she replied. "You preserved what you could. It's more than most ever manage." She studied him. "Do you think less of me because of it?" "No," he said. "I think the world forced you to make an impossible choice. And you chose well." A long pause. "I was angry," she admitted. "At you. For a long time. Because I thought you dismissed me. That you treated my feelings like some obstacle to be removed. I did, Bruno said honestly. She blinked. I thought it was strategic, he continued. That you wanted influence. Protection. A seat at the Reichstable. I didn't see the woman behind the crown. Not clearly. Not until it was too late. Marie looked down at her gloves. I don't want an apology, she said. I just want you to know. I meant every word. Bruno finally took a sip of his beer. The foam clung to his upper lip before he wiped it away with a napkin. And I believe you, he said. Another silence passed between them, quieter this time. Almost gentle. Then, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, Marie stood. I should be going. There's work to do. Even puppet queens have schedules. Bruno stood as well, offering a half bow. Your Grace. Don't do that, she said. Not tonight. Just let it be Marie. He nodded. She turned to go, then paused at the door. In another life? Bruno didn't hesitate. In another life. And just like that, she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of perfume, a nearly full stein of beer, and a lingering ache that no battlefield had ever managed to leave behind. Chapter 427. The Crown Without a Kingdom. The train to Tyrol glided through the alpine valleys beneath a brittle winter sky, the snow-draped peaks standing tall, like ancient judges bearing witness to the choices of men far beneath them. Bruno sat alone in the private compartment. The rhythmic thrum of the rails beneath him offered no comfort at all. There was no warmth in the landscape, no familiarity in its vistas. It was beautiful in the way that glass was beautiful, polished, cold, and easy to bleed against. The seat felt foreign. The silence earned. He stared out the window, watching his reflection blur against the mountains, and thought of her. Since the moment they departed, saying one last farewell, Bruno hadn't thought of her. Marie Adelaide, the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg. The woman was a rarity, something he couldn't understand, comprehend, or even predict. For years she had chased him, and he had always thought it was for the same reasons that all other women had tried as well. Bruno was still haunted by the memories of a past life. A different time, a different place, where virtue was dead, buried beneath the sands of time. And people? Well, they weren't much of people anymore. The societal bonds that once kept us from falling to our baser instincts had been burned in the name of liberty, and with them, so too the soul of humanity. Trust couldn't be forged, and if you were foolish enough to believe such a thing could exist, you deserved what happened to you. In the end, nobody would bat an eye or care. It was a selfish world, a cruel world, a cold world. One he had desperately tried to prevent from becoming a reality in this life. There was just one problem that Bruno was starting to realize as he sat in his booth, waiting to return home. While he had prevented the initial blow that would damn the soul of the West, he had never truly given the people within it the benefit of the doubt, the belief that they could still be good, noble, virtuous. He had always assumed. No, he had learned that without order, without the fabrics and institutions of society to keep us in check, we were all damned, wicked, evil beings at heart. He had seen too much madness in the eyes of too many people claiming virtue and love to believe anyone could really be such a thing anymore. Heidi was an exception, a rarity, a gift from the heavens. Their journey together began as children and had been forged through struggle, sacrifice, and duty for each other and for their children. It was the truest expression of love in this world, and it's why Bruno trusted her, and her alone. But Marie? How could she have possibly genuinely loved him? They had only met a handful of times over the years. It wasn't until she sold her kingdom to the Reich without question that Bruno truly pieced together the truth. Marie had truly loved him, and he could never accept this, because he couldn't accept that such a thing could exist outside of the way he and Heidi had built it. But the moment he realized she had wagered everything on him, not to leave Heidi, but simply to care enough to fight for her people, to defend her against the wolves on both sides of her borders that sought to devour her, he understood the sacrifice she had made. A wager placed, and one poorly at that. That was what weighed upon Bruno's heart. Not that he had rejected her, not that he had let the Kaiser annex her territory and steal her crown, but that he had failed to understand or even entertain the idea that she was genuine, that she had deserved a proper response, one that would help her understand how futile her hopes were, without crushing the purity of her intent. Perhaps in another life, as he had once told her, They could have been together. But he had already given everything he could to another, to Heidi. And had he simply taken the time to explain this in a way that Marie could understand, perhaps she wouldn't have fallen into such a trap, hoping he would save her. Ultimately, Bruno arrived at his new home. The estate in Tyrol was newly built under the facade of restoration, but in truth, it was a modern fortress disguised as a noble residence. Stone walls, reinforced halls, hidden bunkers. The best Alpine artisans and German engineers had shaped it for a man of rank. But it was not his. In the past, Bruno had seldom cared where he lived, so long as the people he cared about were there with him. And Heidi had tried to make their new palace a home. She'd chosen the tapestries, the iron chandeliers, the grain of the wood in the library. But none of that changed the truth. This place had no memories, no ghosts, no worn steps or laughter echoing from staircases carved centuries ago. It was sterile majesty, a crown without a kingdom. And on a day like today, it stung worse than usual, a subtle reminder that life was changing, and he was stuck in a past that no longer existed, unable to truly move on with the world he was helping to create. Bruno arrived just before dusk. The freshly laid gravel crunched beneath his boots as he stepped from the armored staff car to the front entrance. The guards at the gate saluted with sharp discipline, but their eyes betrayed unease. Word had reached them. Not a failure. No, there had been no scandal, no official disgrace. The world still saw Bruno von Zehntner as the iron hand of the Reich. But those close enough to serve near his shadow knew something had changed. He entered the great hall in silence. Heidi met him there, descending the staircase like a ghost returning to earth. Though Bruno had been summoned by the Kaiser without proper explanation, she had heard the signing of the treaty on the radio. It took one look at her man to understand all the weight he carried, a burden she could never help with directly, but could only support in her own way, by his side, as Bruno shuffled forward in life. She was the only one who knew, the only one he had ever told in earnest and detail about his past life. Jokes had been made to those who would never believe him, but she knew everything. The world he had come from, what he was fighting so hard to prevent, and why he had such a hard time understanding that here, and now, in the year 1918, there was still good in the world, and he had already helped preserve it. Heidi couldn't help but ask, a gentle tone in her voice as she confirmed whether or not Bruno would need some extra care tonight. Are you okay? You look like you have been thinking again, and I know how you get when that happens. Bruno, having wanted nothing more than to shove away his current melancholy, decided it would be best to throw himself into the depths of work. And because of that, he simply scoffed before preparing to come up with some excuse. But something came over him just as he was about to lie and say he was fine, that he just needed to tidy up the books. No, he was not going to lie, because to do so would not only deny the truth, that he might be incapable of coming to terms with the world around him as it existed here and now. It would also cheapen the feelings Marie had expressed for him, the sacrifice she had made, gambling on the slightest return for her love, and his brutal rejection that such emotions could ever be true and pure without being built upon a long and hard foundation of mutual struggle. Because of this, Bruno sighed and shook his head, revealing the extent of how far he had fallen inward during the journey home. Truth be told, Heidi, I don't know if I have ever been okay, and I don't know if I ever will be. Heidi immediately made an aggressive move toward Bruno, something she had never done before. And while the man instinctively braced himself, he quickly realized she wasn't attacking him. She hugged him tightly around the chest, softly soothing him with her gentle voice. It's okay to feel like that sometimes. I told you before, didn't I? You don't have to do this all by yourself. I'm here for you. Isn't that the point? Of us. I might not be able to carry your burdens, or even help with them, but I can at least try my best to help pick you up when you fall. Bruno stared at the woman he loved more than anything. She looked up at him with her azure blue eyes, almost a crystallization of the sky itself, now filling with diamond-like tears. He simply smiled. Not because he was free from his depression, but because he realized that while he had thought Heidi was an exception to humanity's wickedness, the reality was that she was the personification of its potential inherent virtue all along. He couldn't help but chuckle as he masked the singular tear falling from his own eye with the palm of his hand, expressing his thoughts aloud. I've been such a damn fool. Heidi, seeing this as an opportunity to help her husband recover from whatever was currently ailing him, leaned in and forcefully stole a kiss before whispering in his ear like a temptress reforged in the body of a saint. "Yeah, but you're my fool." Chapter 428. The gauntlet has been laying. It was hard to believe that barely a year and a half had passed since the Great War came to an end. So much had happened in such a short time that Bruno often felt as though he were being swept along by the changing seasons, too consumed by action to fully grasp the pace of history as it unfolded around him. And yet, here they were, the first Olympic Games of the post-war era, truly about to begin. Originally scheduled for 1916, the Summer Olympics had been postponed due to the war, and then again during the chaos of the succession crisis. It was finally agreed they would be held in 1918, with the next games delayed until 1922. But even before the date was confirmed, Bruno had already begun laying the foundations for what was to come. The stage was global, and Germany would be its center, whether militarily, economically, or, now, athletically. Bruno had worked tirelessly to position the Reich as the preeminent power of the modern world. The Olympics were still in their infancy, not yet the worldwide spectacle they would become in the century to follow. Few nations participated with true seriousness, and fewer still understood the potential of what these games represented. But Bruno did. He remembered a different time, a different world, and he knew full well what the games could become. Not just a contest of strength and speed, but a display of soft power, a crucible where nations revealed their discipline, their vision, and their will to triumph through human excellence. It was a proving ground of prestige, where the champions of tomorrow were not forged in blood, but in fire and sweat and quiet sacrifice. Of course, it was always the wealthiest and most powerful who produced the greatest athletes. Training, equipment, nutrition, facilities, these mattered, perhaps more than anyone liked to admit. Bruno understood this, and unlike those who sought shortcuts through drugs or unethical science, he opted for something more difficult, but infinitely more effective. He had built a system, a nationwide engine for athletic perfection, something akin to what the Soviets would later create in another life, but cleaner, sharper, and far more dangerous in its efficiency. Germany's champions were men sculpted from marble, natural demigods molded through a doctrine of ruthless discipline, cutting-edge nutrition, and access to the most advanced training techniques ever devised. They did not need drugs. They had order. And now, with the games to be held in Berlin of all places, Bruno and the Kaiser had quietly spent years orchestrating something far beyond an athletic competition. This would not be a celebration of international sport. This would be a revelation. A message carved into the sky itself. The old world is dead. In its place, an age of empire and steel. Over the past 2 years, meticulous preparations had been made for this convergence of nations. Though the Great War had ended, much of the world still smoldered in its aftermath. Regions cracked open by revolution, famine, and ideological firestorms. In such uncertain times, the security of the German Reich and of the many dignitaries now gathered in Berlin was of paramount importance. For the duration of the games, every branch of state authority had been mobilized: the Polizei, the federal agents, the Feldgendarmerie, border patrols, even privately contracted mercenaries. All of them working in seamless coordination to ensure that nothing, expected or otherwise, would disrupt the spectacle. It was a dangerous age. France was already burning, devoured by the flames of its own radicalism, and the Reich could not afford to let such fire leap the borders. The world was watching. The Olympic Games were not merely a celebration, they were a statement, and no blood could be allowed to stain it. As a result, security across Berlin was suffocating. Not in the letter of the law, perhaps, but certainly in spirit. Many visitors found their rights and liberties strained well beyond what was considered tolerable. They grumbled, protested, made appeals. But such measures were necessary. German intelligence had already uncovered several plots to destroy the centerpiece of the Games, a coordinated effort to shatter the Reich's image on the global stage. They were intercepted, brutally interrogated, and quietly executed. Their comrades soon followed. The target? The arena of triumph. The Colosseum of a new age. The temple to German steel and civilization. And under no circumstances would it be allowed to fall. The new Colosseum had risen from the rubble of the old Berlin Stadttheater, the arena of triumph. A fusion of historicist architecture and cutting-edge infrastructure. The structure was enclosed from the elements yet alive with modern power, electric lighting, air conditioning, central heating, and a ventilation system so refined it could rival anything on Earth. It was not just a stadium. It was a testament, a physical embodiment of Germany's wealth, discipline, and industrial superiority. Capable of seating nearly 100,000 spectators, the arena was a monument to will. Every polished marble pillar, every bronze statue, every echo of the vaulted ceilings whispered not indulgence, but intent. Its design was purposeful. Tiered seating split the masses into three castes. The people sat closest to the arena floor, while the foreigners were centered at the midpoint, offered a place of respect, but not deference. As for the empire and its ruling class, they were naturally seated highest of all, directly beneath golden eagles, where the Kaiser and his commanders overlooked the field like gods atop Olympus. This was no mere sport. From the moment the torch was lit, the message would be undeniable. This was Bruno's Germany, an empire reborn through fire, honed in blood, driven not by ideology, but by order. Bruno stood at the Kaiser's side, front and center, as the torchbearer began the ceremonial run, an ancient tradition from a world so distant it felt more like myth than memory. His family was nearby, seated in the imperial box. As the thunderous applause began to fade, the lights across the arena began to extinguish one by one, swallowed by a creeping darkness that enveloped the vast structure like a curtain falling before a grand performance. Only the torch remained lit, a flickering point of flame in an ocean of night. Whispers filled the air. Unease settled like fog. Eva, seated beside her fiancé, the Kaiser's grandson, leaned forward, voice sharp with concern. "What's going on?" Bruno calmly placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. Though his face betrayed no emotion, the excitement in his voice was unmistakable. "Shoo, just watch. You're about to witness history in the making." Then it began. The drums hit first, deep, thunderous strikes that echoed through the arena like cannon fire. The orchestra roared to life, amplified by the chamber's flawless acoustics, greater even than the fabled Vienna concert hall. But this was no polite symphony. The sound was modern, violent, electric, Mortal Kombat meets Pride FC, a battlefield anthem wrapped in symphonic brutality. It was music that made the soul want to rise, to fight, to conquer. Raw, primal, relentless. With the first pounding step of the runner, the arena ignited. Floodlights erupted along the central runway, blinding white, piercing the dark like divine pillars. Then came the colored lights, red, white, and the black of shadow, coalescing in the air above the torchbearer into a radiant, blazing banner of the German Reich emblazoned across the dome. The torchbearer ran. The music swelled. The crowd held its breath. As he ascended the ziggurat and reached the pyre, the orchestra surged into its crescendo. With one motion, the flame was passed, and the fire roared to life. A wall of pyrotechnics detonated around the arena, brilliant, deafening, overwhelming. But that was not the end. As the flames subsided and the smoke cleared, a new revelation awaited. Rows upon rows of the Imperial Guard stood below, perfectly still, perfectly aligned. Their decorations gleamed beneath the lights, combat medals from wars won, honor earned in steel and fire. Then they moved. A synchronized display of military pageantry unfolded, flawless, fearsome, impossible to ignore. With every movement, the orchestra shifted tempo again, now furious, martial, triumphant. It was not merely a celebration of the games. It was a declaration. Germany would win them, and they would do so in dominant fashion. The display was staggering. Foreign dignitaries sat in stunned silence, eyes wide, mouths half open. This was more than choreography. It was an engineering marvel, coordinated to the second, orchestrated to perfection, and unknown technologies, developed by Bruno's companies in secret, had brought it all to life. Even as the crowd roared, the world's delegation sat bitter and quiet. No one could match this. Not now. Not for decades. Bruno turned to his daughter. She was looking up at him with wide, unblinking eyes. The awe in her gaze said everything. "Father, don't tell me. This, all of this, was your creation? He smiled faintly and brushed his hand through her golden hair, ever the gentle father despite the battlefield he had just staged. Me? Oh no, sweet child. I played only a small part. This is the combined effort of our people, of our nation. And now the world must bear witness to a grandeur they won't come close to matching for another 2 or 3 decades. Magnificent, isn't it? Eva said nothing. She could only stare as the ceremony faded. The athletes began their march beneath the stadium's radiant light, and the rest of the world looked on, shaken, uncertain, and utterly outclassed. Only the Germans walked with heads held high, and the message had been sent. Chapter 429, Picking Your Battles at the Right Time. The opening ceremony had concluded, leaving the crowd in complete and utter awe. On the morrow, the games would begin. But tonight, Germany celebrated. A grand reception was held in Berlin for the world's leaders and international delegates, those who had come to witness the dawning of a new era, an era of steel and order, of civilization reshaped by discipline, not decay. For the Germans, the air was thick not with arrogance, but with assurance. A miasma of quiet confidence permeated the grand halls. They had trained harder, longer, and under better conditions than any other nation. And now, they were ready, not merely to compete, but to dominate. As the athletes prepared for the coming contests of strength, agility, perception, and sheer force of will, Bruno and his family stood among the powerful. Most of the men present were representatives of governments that had been enemies a mere 2 years prior. The blood had dried, at least on the surface. Now was the time to rebuild and to reckon. Delegates from Britain were present. King George himself was in attendance. The weary sovereign who had narrowly avoided watching the flower of the British army crushed in the final Central Powers push toward Paris. He had turned his attention instead to the empire, rallying what strength remained to quell rebellion in the colonies with ruthless fervor. Ireland had been subdued in brutal fashion over the past 2 years, with tactics reminiscent of the suppression of the Easter Rising in Bruno's former life. The heartland of the United Kingdom had returned to order, but its empire was bleeding. From India to Africa, the colonial dominions were alight with revolt. Rivers ran red in places the British maps called civilized. And yet here stood King George and his ministers, faces lined and drawn, not just by war, but by the agony of the aftermath. If the Great War had tested their resolve, the last 2 years had scourged their souls. The British king did not look fondly upon Bruno. Wilhelm, he could tolerate. There was shared blood, old ties, the illusion of noble camaraderie. But Bruno? Bruno was the knife behind the crown, the man who had turned the strategy into humiliation, a general who had rewritten warfare itself. He feared him, he resented him, and perhaps, in the quietest moments, he even admired him. But he did not forgive him. Bruno, for his part, returned the sentiment, though his disdain was aimed elsewhere. His gaze fell coldly upon the so-called representatives of the French Republic. You might ask, how could they be here when France itself was burning, when the Republic was dead in all but name? Because these were the cowards who had fled Paris before it was made to kneel. They had left their people behind, abandoned their soldiers, their cities, their streets. And now they reappeared, clean-shaven and dressed in finery, sipping wine in Berlin as though they still had a country to speak for. Bruno's eyes narrowed. The sons of Ludwig, the father of the Reich, had come to reclaim what was theirs. And these men, these ghosts of a fallen republic, had no place in the new age. Though Bruno found these insolent curs, who dared to claim legitimacy, nothing short of an eyesore, he remained a man of civilization. He would not initiate conflict in a hall of peace. But should the air grow sharp with challenge, he would end it, without hesitation and without remorse. Eva, however, had been holding in her fury for well over an hour. And rightfully so, the French delegation, what little remained of it, clustered near one of the gilded columns, sipping tall glasses of wine and sneering behind thin smiles. Their words, while hushed, were careless enough for anyone fluent in French to understand. She wasn't just fluent. She spoke French with the grace of a native Parisian, so precise, so natural, that these jesters would feel the sting of their own nationalism if they heard a German princess speak their mother tongue more eloquently than they ever could. And yet, Their vulgar words prompted nothing more than an eye roll from her, a quiet gesture of annoyance, not outrage. Look at them, pretending to be emperors. No culture, no soul, just iron and uniforms. Her fingers tightened slightly on her glass, not out of frustration, but at the sheer audacity of the remark, given the context behind it. Even so, her expression remained composed. Not in a room like this. Not under the watchful eyes of diplomats, generals, and kings, and certainly not with her fiancé, the Kaiser's grandson, standing beside her, utterly captivated by her poise. Though she had been born the daughter of a man who was once the ninth son of a Prussian junker lord, Bruno's exploits had long since elevated their family. The main line now held the status of counts, and more recently, Bruno had been granted hereditary princely rule over Tyrol, making him a monarch in his own right. And she was now a genuine princess. She knew better than to make a scene. The temptation flared, of course, but she had been raised well. And more than that, she had been raised by him. Her gaze drifted toward her father. Bruno hadn't moved. He stood at ease, a glass of dark wine in one hand, the weight of the room behind him. He looked neither amused nor offended, just aware. Then, in perfect French, spoken just loud enough for the Frenchman to hear, and no one else, he murmured, "Let these little men, exiled from their homeland, make their scornful remarks." His voice rumbled like distant thunder. Had I wanted to, I could have burned their capital to the ground. The artillery was loaded. The path was open. But I chose otherwise, not out of mercy, but out of discipline. A pause, then a slow breath, as if recalling the decision itself. But to compel the French to surrender without the need to fight, and preserve the inherent beauty of Paris, that is supreme victory. He let the words settle like dust on marble, then added with a trace of contempt. Or it would have been, if the damned fools hadn't burned it down themselves the moment I left. Bruno had grown weary of the insults cast at Germany during what was meant to be a celebration of peace, a celebration these so-called diplomats had no rightful place in. They were not emissaries. They were relics, drunken, exiled, and without a flag. And now, they had wandered too far into the lion's den. He had let them dig their own grave, inch by inch, with every sip of stolen wine. Now it was time to bury them. He laced his words with venom, delivered them with surgical precision, and watched the bait take. The Frenchmen snapped. Their pride, sodden with wine and crippled by shame, could not resist the provocation. They turned, shouting obscenities in their native tongue. Loud, obvious. Eva's eyes widened as her father, unbothered, reached to hand her a fresh glass and gave her a subtle wink and a smile. Then, softly, "Now it is time to defend our home from these unwanted intruders." With calm deliberation, Bruno adjusted his tie and stepped forward. The entire room shifted. All eyes turned. Conversations froze mid-sentence. The wolf was moving, and 3 fattened pigs had laid their bellies bare before his fangs. Chapter 430, Putting Away the Strays. The French delegation had somehow managed to worm their way into the arena of victory, now watching from afar in a VIP booth where delegates of each major nation sat, admiring the processions following the opening ceremony. But during this time, they had been isolated. Everyone knew they held no legitimacy, no authority. They flew the banner of a dead republic while hiding in its more stable colonies, masquerading as the governing body of a nation in total anarchy, existing in name only, and as an ideal. That was all. So when they found no one approached them, no respect given, no deference paid, they turned to the bountiful free food and wine, engorging themselves beyond the point of intoxication. And as the wine flowed, so too did the complaints. They began to whine, sneer, and speak loudly of their supposed superiority over Germany. Twice in 50 years France had fallen to its eastern neighbor, both times utterly humiliated, dominated by a people they had long believed themselves superior to. But this defeat, this modern collapse, was unforgivable. The annexation of Alsace-Lothringen was permanent now. The lands once stolen by France had returned to German hands, and that could not be undone. Bitterness consumed them. Their words, vulgar and petulant, drew no attention from others, at least not most. One young girl, not even legally an adult, gave them a sidelong glance, clearly understanding some French. But she said nothing. until her father turned. A man with sharp features and ice-blue eyes. A man who calmly faced them and spoke in French so flawless, so Parisian in tone, that they felt ashamed of their own heritage upon hearing it. And what he said was true. He had spared Paris. The outskirts had burned, yes, but only those districts of little cultural or historical value. The heart of the city had remained intact. Bruno had warned the inhabitants ahead of time, scattering flyers before the offensive. He had given them time to flee or surrender. He had brought order. It wasn't the Germans who destroyed Paris. It was those within it, after the army left. You dare have the gall to say you tried to preserve Paris? I would have liked to see you try to burn it to the ground. You filthy barbarian, one of them shouted. Bruno's expression didn't change, but a flicker of sadistic pleasure danced in his eyes. The bait had been taken. Do you know what I did when Paris fell? He began, voice low. If memory serves, you lot saw the tides turning and looted the national treasury before fleeing to North Africa. Not because I investigated, no. Because had you stayed, the revolutionaries who burned your beloved Palace of Versailles would have lined you up and shot you first. Silence fell. I didn't sack the Louvre. I didn't torch the Sorbonne. I didn't parade your women through the streets like war trophies. I brought order. He set his glass down, never breaking eye contact. And when you demanded I leave, without a government, without a plan, without so much as a roadmap for what came next, I honored your pride. I left you a city intact and watched from a distance as you set fire to its soul. Paris shouldn't have burned. Not like that. But you all wanted to kill your kings. You cheered as the guillotine took tradition and stability with it. His voice dropped further. And this is how liberty ends. Always. Then he turned the blade. You do not bear the torch of civilization. You lost that claim the moment you deposed the House of Bourbon. What trail you blaze is one of destruction, death, and eventually anarchy. As history has shown, it is the fate shared by all who follow such hollow ideals built on the failures of relentless utopianism and a rejection of what makes us human, naively believing we could ever be as graceful as the angels in heaven above. We are not gods, and you least of all. He let the final cut come slow and merciless. You call me a barbarian, Bruno said, his voice cool. But you're the ones killing each other in the streets of a once civilized nation over something as simple as bread. He let the silence hang, then added with a soft, lethal edge. So tell me, who here is the real savage? Because from where I stand, I see only you three. You are welcome to remain for the duration of the games. After all, someone must represent the people of France, even if only symbolically. Then, without raising his voice, he delivered the final line like a sentence passed. But any further outbursts like this, and you'll see just how quickly a nation of chivalry deals with disrespect, especially when it is gracious enough to be hosting the party and paying the bill. Then Bruno shot a glance toward the American diplomats, as if to say, you too are among the damned. You just don't know it yet. With that, Bruno turned away from the sputtering Frenchman, calmly picking up another glass of Chardonnay. He walked past his eldest daughter, Eva, and gave her shoulder a gentle pat before leaning in to whisper words only she could hear. And that, my sweet little girl, is how we put away the strays in our house. Eva said nothing as her father passed her by, simply wearing a malevolent smile as she witnessed the Frenchman utterly ignored once more by those present the moment their disruption had been properly dealt with. Bruno, however, continued onward, joining his wife Heidi, who was engaged in lively conversation with their daughter-in-law Alia, as well as the Kaiserin and the Tsarina. The royals were discussing the possibility of inducting Alia into one of their female chivalric orders, impressed by Heidi's glowing account of her charitable works. A feat, Heidi claimed, impossible without the aid of the young Russian war orphan who had somehow married her eldest son. By law, Alia was already a countess, adopted by Heinrich, the man who had led the charge that captured Paris. But this was the first time she stood among such women of power. When Bruno heard the suggestion, he spoke without hesitation. I think that's a wonderful idea. Alia may be my daughter by law, but she is also my goddaughter, and one of the most virtuous women I've had the honor to know. She would be a fitting dame of any of your noble orders. That is, if you would allow me the honor of offering my recommendation alongside that of my beloved wife. The surrounding nobility murmured in surprise at his words, the tension from moments before already forgotten. Back at the wine table, Eva sipped her glass and shook her head with a half-smile. Father truly is a master of the game, and no one sees it, except Mother. Chapter 431, Ghosts in the Night. Bruno and his family had enjoyed the opening ceremony and the diplomatic meeting, and now they returned home for the night. Though they resided in Tyrol, they still maintained their estate in Berlin as a home away from home. Erwin and Alia were the exception to this rule, living in the quaint manor in Berlin's old quarter, a gift from Bruno's father on his wedding night. It was where Bruno and Heidi had raised their first children. Erwin approached his father, shaking his hand before being pulled into a brief embrace. Bruno wasn't about to let his son grow distant just because he had grown up and gotten married. Erwin didn't try to break away. His father had become far more affectionate as they both grew older, perhaps because Erwin no longer needed a disciplinarian to guide him, but a supportive father, one who recognized his son was now old enough to make his own decisions. After the embrace, Erwin stepped back, thanking Bruno for the magnificent ceremony and assuring him that he and Alia would meet them the following morning for the games. It was truly a sight I'll remember for the rest of my life, Father. Now Alia will head home for the evening. I do hope you, Mother, and the rest make your way back safely. I'll see you in the morning. With a final farewell, their two paths diverged. Though Erwin was Bruno's heir, he would not walk the same path of sword and shield. That was not his role. It was better that he lived away from the family now that he was starting his own. As for Bruno, his family was always under watch, the eyes of the state ever upon them. In Berlin, they were always on high alert, though the citizens were oblivious. Bruno, as well as other high-profile figures like the Kaiser, was under constant surveillance by those unseen forces, the shadows keeping the demons at bay. Even now, as Bruno and his family split off for the night, shadows stirred beneath Berlin's streets. A storm broke overhead as Bruno climbed into the armored motorcade. It seems God has blessed us with a storm tonight to hide the scent of blood that is bound to appear soon enough. And how right Bruno was. It wasn't because of intelligence or whispers of rogue elements from war-torn regions escaping the grasp of German intelligence, or the Kaiser's notorious secret police, the Stasi, who were known for their ruthlessness and efficiency. No, Bruno was simply speaking from his understanding of human nature and the most wretched of its kind. Tonight, after the celebration was over and the state's eyes were no longer focused on the arena, the enemy would make their move. Why? Because Germany had its moment of glory, an act of arrogance against an entire world watching. But tomorrow was where they would have to prove this was reality. And if the attack occurred midway through the event, then it would be a monumental humiliation. Bruno was willing to bet his life on the fact that he had predicted this correctly. Luckily for him, he didn't have to, because there were better men hunting the scent of those damned fools who had provoked a monster they had no true understanding of. And Bruno's instincts had been right on the ball as the French revolutionaries who had infiltrated the arena of triumph after the festivities ended were blissfully unaware they were already being watched. Hidden in the darkness, behind the shadows, were men whose deaths had been confirmed in the Great War, their remains said to be buried in military cemeteries. Yet here they were, lurking in silence. These were the ghosts in the shadows, stalking the wreckage left by those who sought to spread chaos. One of the revolutionaries cursed in French as he noticed the malfunctioning fuse. God damn it, I told you to get the longer fuse. What the hell is this SH? Before he could finish, he turned to see a figure clad in all black leather trench coat, a helmet, and a rubber gas mask. The eerie amber-red tint from his mask's glass lenses reflected the moonlight, giving him a predatory aura. The revolutionary froze, staring at the figure. The agent didn't speak. He merely raised a finger to his lips, silent, lethal. Without a sound, he pulled the pin from a gas canister and tossed it onto the ground. Within moments, the gas began to spread, and the revolutionaries gasped as their muscles locked up, their throats closing from the deadly neurotoxin. As the final moments of their lives passed, the agent stood still, calculating. His watch ticked as the seconds counted down to their inevitable end. He gave a report on his radio, his voice calm, detached. Doses of the experimental nerve gas are sufficient for immediate incapacitation and death within 10 seconds flat. Proceed to experiment further on proper dosage for optimized uses across a variety of conditions. Also, send a team to purge the area and dispose of the explosives. We cannot afford any mistakes. A civilian death is the last thing we need on our hands. He then turned and disappeared back into the shadows, vanishing without a trace, as if he had never been there. The only thing left were the bodies of the dead revolutionaries and the mess of their final moments. But even that would be cleaned up quickly. No evidence of the agent's work would remain. Just like the others who lurked in the dark, their presence erased from the world, except for their message. This was just one of many such examples on this night, where the Stasi would test one of Germany's latest and more lethal weapons on the fools who had dared to make trouble where they didn't belong. The culmination of these tests would soon lead to the creation of sarin gas, an advanced neurotoxin. A weapon so devastating that the Reich would reserve the right to deploy it only in the direst of circumstances, when the survival of the nation itself was at stake. The world, however, would remain ignorant of its existence. And if they ever learned of it, it would be too late for them to do anything about it. Chapter 432. Let the games begin. The next morning, Bruno enjoyed a breakfast with his family, like he had done every single day since coming back from the war. That is, when he was not called away to some other diplomatic visit that lasted more than a single day on his end. Heidi seemed very much happy to be back in the old estate. Not quite as happy as she would be had they been living in the old manor again. That was their first home, the place where their family was built, where their love blossomed beyond childhood naivety and into a true marriage. She was not the slightest bit upset that Bruno had given the home to their son Erwin so that he could do the same with Alya. She just wished, somewhere deep down in their heart, their circumstances in this life never forced them to move beyond such a humble and loving abode. Either way, she seemed quite thrilled about the day's events, as the first of all major sporting events would be taking place. And since these games were being held in Berlin, the German Olympic Affairs Committee ensured that combat-oriented games were to be held today. Boxing, wrestling, kickboxing, fencing, archery, marksmanship, etc. These were the games that would be held at the start, and Bruno would not settle for total victory unless every single medal in every event and category went to Germany. His athletes had been given the greatest training facilities on the planet. They lived, breathed, ate, drank, prayed, and trained. That was their entire life, with only minor exaggerations, as a member of the German national Olympic team. And today Bruno intended to showcase it. The Kaiser stood nervously in the VIP booth next to Bruno, quickly offering the man a drink, thinking perhaps he would be as anxious about the upcoming events as himself. Care for a glass of Chardonnay? Or is Merlot more you, Hugh? Bruno couldn't help but chuckle as he took the drink and sipped from it no more than enough to make the Kaiser comfortable, after which he was quick to remind the man that today was their day. Your Majesty, though I'm not your physician, I should remind you that you would do well to relax. The games have yet to begin, and trust me when I say, there are no surprises to be had today, at least not for the two of us. Let the world watch as the greatest athletes are dominated in pure combat by our own. It is a mathematical impossibility that we will lose a single gold today and silvers. Highly unlikely. At most, we might lose a bronze or two, but even that is doubtful. Just sit back and enjoy yourself. I'm going to go watch the first match with my family, so make sure to enjoy yourself. After saying this, Bruno patted the Kaiser on the back, before walking away, sitting down in between his two oldest daughters while their younger siblings watched with awe, the youngest of which was perhaps just old enough to have this be embedded as a core memory. Elsa was the first to speak today, her voice cold and calculating as she watched the two boxers face off in the ring while the referee went over the rules with them. 13 seconds. Eva looked over at her younger sister and scoffed in disbelief, clearly understanding what she was implying, as if it was absurd. 13 seconds. Are you mad? How do you figure that? Eva was looking at the two fighters. One was from the UK, an old-school gypsy boxer, no doubt having been through a variety of fights in the streets. Bare-knuckle, tough, aggressive, not afraid of going down, a do-or-die type. The other was a young German athlete. His body was almost entirely devoid of scars or any sign of roughness, especially in the face. Most thought this meant he was untested, a young pretty boy going against a legend in the ring. But Elsa knew better. She knew exactly what it would take to get this far in the system that her father had made. The fact that the man looked virtually unscathed from being raised in the sport of boxing meant one of three things. However, she didn't reveal these thoughts. Instead, she simply explained her reasoning to her elder sister with the mathematics she had used to come to this absurd calculation. The fight will last 13 seconds, 2 seconds for the approach, 1 second for the strike, 10 seconds for the referee's count, 14 seconds at the most if the other guy throws first, and an additional second to counter and land a shot. Eva scoffed and rolled her eyes at her sister's audacity, voicing her true thoughts aloud as she did so. "You're actually insane." However, Elsa was undeterred and simply shifted her head slightly so that she could look directly at the elder sister's eyes, staring coldly at them with absolute confidence and certainly in her own expressionless face. "Would you like to make a bet?" Eva was slightly taken aback by her sister's unreasonable confidence, thinking for just a second that the girl might know something she didn't. But in the end, it was simply too absurd. A single punch to end the fight at the start? Incredibly unlikely if possible, and thus she wagered the odds. "Okay, fine, what's at stake?" Heidi was about to intervene in the two girls and their sibling rivalry, believing that gambling was both a sin and a vice young noble lady like themselves shouldn't be engaging in. But before she could do so, Bruno grabbed her hand that was reaching over his shoulder and kissed it, looking back at her and shaking his head with a subtle smirk. At the same time, Elsa named her price. "I'll say an entire year's allowance. This is the first Olympic game we are able to attend. Might as well make it memorable, right?" That was a convincing enough reason for Eva to agree, and thus she reached her hand over to seal the deal with a shake. The two sisters quickly sealed the deal in front of Bruno, who had been quietly watching their discussion with amusement. That is until Elsa leaned over and hugged him, showing more emotion than she ever did in front of anyone, but her father, as she begged like a child half her age for him to keep her older sister to her word. "Daddy, you'll make sure Eva honors the wager when I win, won't you?" Bruno, knowing full well she was playing him with her usual charm, couldn't help but break out into laughter as he pet her silky golden hair, assuring her he was indeed a witness and was a fair man. "Of course, sweetie. Now you two quiet down. The fight is about to begin." Eva had a smug expression, while Elsa went back to being an ice princess the moment she was forced to let go of her father. And then it began. The crowd went silent as the two fighters approached one another, and just as Elsa had predicted, the hyper-aggressive gypsy-style boxer from the UK threw a heavy shot, loading up on it in advance as he did so. With the agility, reflexes, and nimbleness of a man half his size, the German boxer effortlessly slipped past the punch, bringing a loaded uppercut right into his opponent's jaw and dropping him cold on the spot. 14 seconds, just as Elsa had predicted. Everyone was stunned in the arena, everyone except Elsa and Bruno, who knew just how capable his boxers were, and how underdeveloped boxing as a sport was in the rest of the world. Elsa finally broke the silence with a smug smirk and a haughty tone. "I told you so." Eva could only look over at her little sister as if she was some kind of monster, while Bruno couldn't help but to break out into laughter again. Even the girl's mother couldn't help but giggle at how right her little angel was. And thus Germany had shocked the world with the opening game at the 1918 Summer Olympics. Chapter 433, A Glimpse of the Future. The world was left in complete and utter disbelief, not just by the first match of the day, but by all the games held thereafter. From the first punch thrown to the last shot fired, Germany had swept the competition. Gold, silver, bronze, all were claimed by German athletes. On multiple occasions, the International Committee paused the contests, investigating suspicions of cheating because the results seemed so improbable. Yet every time, no violation of the rules was found. Germany and its athletes were simply that superior, not because of some imagined Übermensch genetic advantage, as had been falsely claimed during the 1936 Olympics of Bruno's past life, but because Bruno had spent nearly 2 decades carefully cultivating the world's greatest athletes from among his own people. His knowledge of future developments in sports, access to unmatched training facilities funded by the state, and advanced insights into nutrition and human biomechanics had all contributed. The result of raising an entire generation under these conditions was now undeniable. The events were more than mere spectacles of athletic dominance. They showcased perfected sportsmanship between victorious Germans and their defeated opponents. An expression of chivalry in an era where wars were no longer fought in the old ways. These notions had found new life within the civilian athletic arena. As the day's events neared conclusion, the Kaiser took the stage, stepping to a microphone to deliver a grandiose speech of camaraderie, sportsmanship, and cultural exchange. However, just as he began, Bruno stepped forward and whispered something into his ear that only the two of them could hear. Yet, the gathered crowd and those listening to radio broadcasts clearly heard Wilhelm's surprise. "What? Here? Now? Well, if you insist. I suppose it could be one last exciting bout of entertainment." Bruno stepped back towards his seating area, while the Kaiser explained to the crowd that the day's festivities were not yet concluded, as Germany had prepared an unorthodox exhibition for the world to witness. To everyone's surprise, Bruno stopped in front of his eldest daughter, who was still seated, puzzled by the unfolding scene. His expression was filled with fatherly pride as he extended his hand in invitation. "Eva, my beloved daughter, would you do me the honor of being my dance partner on this fine evening?" Eva knew her father wasn't referring to dancing, and she immediately became embarrassed as all eyes turned toward her. Still, she wanted confirmation and stammered out her response. You can't possibly mean." Bruno cut her off quickly with a smirk and a promise. "Yes, baby girl. Now go fetch your sword and let's dance." The crowd waited anxiously, murmuring in confusion and excitement over what might occur next. When the stadium's lights illuminated once more, they were astonished to see two fencers upon the stage in full protective gear, wielding neither foil, saber, nor épée, but rather old-school rapiers, blunted and tipped with rubber for safety. Yet one thing was immediately apparent as the two duelists raised their blades in an honorable salute. One of these fencers was a woman. Outrageous, unorthodox, and provocative, too many traditional nobles in attendance. However, they had no time to protest as steel clashed against steel. This wasn't the brutish hacking of barbarians, but the elegant and graceful dance of Renaissance duelists. An ancient tradition reborn, performed by opponents of opposite sexes. Despite Bruno's clear physical advantages, Eva stood her ground expertly, using refined techniques to parry, riposte, and counter her father's moves flawlessly. Finally, her blade struck true, landing squarely on Bruno's chest. The judge raised a flag decisively. Point confirmed, blue corner. Bruno chuckled as he twirled his sword in a stylish flourish, pride evident in his voice as he complimented Eva's improved technique. "That's my little girl. You've gotten better since we last sparred." Eva's posture, however, showed a slight pout. Too enthralled in the contest to remember the watching audience and global listeners, she dropped her usual proud and formal demeanor into the tone of a bratty child, admitting a truth only the most knowledgeable fencers present had realized. "Daddy, you cheated. It's not fair if you let me score." Bruno didn't admit guilt. Instead, he acknowledged his daughter's talent by launching into an expert assault, displaying the full extent of his mastery, a flurry any lesser opponent would have succumbed to immediately. The crowd watched, bewildered, but no longer outraged. They were witnessing something unusual, perhaps unorthodox, yet deeply inspiring. A father teaching his daughter to fence, not for honor or blood, but to strengthen their bond. Though no one knew precisely who was beneath the masks, they were captivated, eyes fixed intently on every swift movement, fearful of missing even a moment. Eva performed admirably under immense pressure, demonstrating that despite physical disparities, her technique might even surpass her father's, who, during his academic years, had been the undisputed empire-wide champion of Menser. By the end, Bruno narrowly secured victory, finishing just 1 point ahead. As the swords lowered and bows were exchanged, the 100,000-strong audience exploded into thunderous applause. Eva stood stunned, looking through her mask at the adoring crowd. Bruno stepped forward, gently patting her shoulder and whispering words she'd never forget. "Congratulations. Through sheer elegance and grace, you've convinced even the most stubborn traditionalists that women belong in athletics, even a discipline as ancient, noble, and masculine as fencing. You just changed the world, baby girl. I'm proud of you." Eva stood in silence, instinctively bowing to the crowd with her father at her side. The applause swelled even louder as she processed his words. He had used the sport she loved, one she'd fought her way into as a child, back when Bruno had only been teaching her younger brother Erwin the art of the sword, as a lesson. A lesson not just for her, but for the world. That even if female athletes lacked the explosive power of their male counterparts, even if they differed in endurance or agility, they could still captivate the world, if trained, refined, and presented with the same respect, dignity, and nobility. And in that moment, Eva could not help but admire her father's daring. Without realizing it, her hand slipped into his, holding his wrist as he continued to wave to the adoring crowd. He couldn't hear her over the thunder of applause, but she said it anyway, softly, from the bottom of her heart. I am so blessed to have you as my father. Chapter 434. No Rest for a Martyr. To say that the world was stunned by what they had witnessed 2 days straight, whether during the opening ceremony on the first day or the games and final exhibition the following, was perhaps the understatement of a lifetime. The world, especially those who had access to near-instant communication methods, went absolutely insane after hearing what Germany had pulled off. This was no longer the heralded army with a state. No, they had proven a refinement of culture and athletics in a way that was overwhelming. And to top this all off, it was later revealed the Habsburgs played an enormous role in the opening ceremony and the artistic choices of the overall events. To put it simply, Germany had emerged from the ashes of the Great War not a broken and humiliated nation, but a prouder, stronger, and more refined than ever before. And its unification with Austria had seemed to play a part in this. How pragmatic was it for the Österreich to make such grand contributions in such a short time frame? Nobody really knew Bruno had pulled off greater miracles in the past, but at the very least, it was advertised as such for diplomatic purposes. And the Kaiser was more than willing to share the credit in this regard. To simply put, Germany had been divided into 2 spheres of influence. The Hohenzollerns, the Prussian kings, represented Germany's militaristic, political, and economic strength, while the lands of the Habsburg crown had become those known for the arts, the pursuits of scientific grandeur, and high culture on a magnitude that now exceeded and expanded beyond what they had proven to the world in the preceding century. This was a new Germany, a better Germany, one which Bruno had been the architect of, and one which the world could only watch as it blazed a path forward where they could only watch from behind, gazing on in its trail with pure, unbridled envy. The following events proved this to be true. Germany emerged as the primary victor of these games, with the Russian Empire only gaining a handful of bronze medals to claim their own. And even then, it was theorized by those who witnessed that these may have been purposely sacrificed by third-string German athletes for diplomatic reasons. A sentiment only further stoked by the camaraderie Nicholas and Kaiser seemed to have forged over the course of the next few weeks in Berlin. The Tsar vowing to emulate Germany's model for success and to become a dark horse in the next games, which were only 2 years away. Eventually, the Olympic Games came to an end of totality, and every visitor had left the borders of the German Reich once and for all, allowing the capital of an empire that had been up constantly on edge to finally gain some much-needed sleep. Bruno returned home to Tyrol with his family, only his son Erwin and his bride Alia staying behind in the city where they continued to live together as a newlywed couple. After finally collapsing on his bed, Bruno felt like he could sleep 1,000 years. But Heidi would not allow the man to rest just yet, as she laid down by his side and reminded him of something important. You do remember that you have an appointment to negotiate a peace between Romania and Hungary tomorrow morning here in our home, right? Both of them have been warring over the region since you renounced your claim over it, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart. And how better to negotiate this peace than the man who gave it up under the condition they could peacefully solve the dispute themselves? A promise they failed to live up to. Bruno could only groan as if he had been dealt a lethal blow before turning over on his side and hugging his wife tightly, reverting to an almost infantile state as he slammed his head into her bosom, as if trying to run and hide from his responsibilities, all while begging for her help like a child. Heidi, please save me. I have no patience to deal with such monumental stupidity. I just want to sleep like a vampire until the next era begins, and awaken from my coffin confused and surprised by the world around me. Heidi simply laughed at Bruno's sudden attack, clinging him tight to her chest as she mocked him for his deliberately foolish behavior. "What are you, my child? Stop being so stupid and put on your big boy pants. Or perhaps would you like me to nurse you like the infant you're pretending to be?" Bruno finally pulled his head out of where they were hidden and smirked at his wife with a devious grin as he responded to her question with one of his own. "You know if I answer that honestly you're going to get angry, right?" The woman was enraged enough by the implication as she flicked her husband in the nose and began scolding him for his current deliberately obtuse behavior. "Behave yourself, mister. We might be home and in the comfort of our own room, but there is a time and a place for everything, and it's not now. So go get washed up and ready for bed. You have to be up bright and early tomorrow. You have a duty to those people to see this matter resolved properly. It doesn't matter how briefly you were their prince. You owe it to them to make this work." Bruno could only act sullen and resigned as he got off the bed and did as he was told, knowing full well Heidi had a point, even if he didn't want to admit it. All he could express was his own left to walk the path he had chosen. Apparently there is no rest for a martyr. Now is there? Heidi simply smirked with victory at her husband's futile and exaggerated display of misery and responded in kind to it. "You wish." Chapter 435. The Lion of Tyrol. Just as Heidi had said the next morning, the newly constructed Palace of Tyrol held peace talks between the delegations from Hungary and Romania, or at least the section of it that was currently livable, as a building as grand as that which Bruno was building for future generations of his family to reign from was a multi-year project, even with the most efficient and capable labor force known to man. Both the Kingdom of Hungary and Romania desired and had attempted to annex Transylvania after Bruno allowed referendum as a sign of good faith to the turbulent region, and an example being led towards a more peaceful solution. The referendum was largely in favor of independence, but independence was not easily secured, nor won simply because the people gave their voice to the idea. And because of its inherent weakness militarily, the newly sovereign Grand Principality of Transylvania and the monarch chosen by the people quickly found themselves invaded by both of their neighbors. Romania and Hungary immediately moved their troops into the region, attacking from both sides in a race to reach the capital dam near simultaneously, to the point where the monarch had long since surrendered, and instead the Hungarian and Romanian armies were now exchanging blows, hoping for the best. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed and broke down, the majority of serious military hardware, like Austro-Hungarian light tanks, limited air corps, and modernized artillery found themselves on the Austrian sides of the border, leaving the Hungarian forces now led by a Hungarian general who proclaimed himself king in the absence of the Habsburgs with a military that, while having significantly more experience than the Romanians who had remained neutral during the Great War, was armed roughly the same. The Hungarian-Romanian War was just one of many small wars being fought in the Balkans at this very moment as a result of the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. However, it was the only one Bruno actually had any stake in, as for a very brief time, prior to renouncing his claim over it, Bruno was the de facto Prince of Transylvania where this war was being fought. As a result, Bruno was currently seated at a table where he met with both kings of the belligerent nations, as well as several of their ministers, delegates, and generals. Some of these men Bruno had known personally during his time in the Great War. Hungarian generals who once took up arms for the Habsburgs were now calling another man king, and were giving Bruno a complex gaze. On the one hand, they felt like their past ties of blood, sweat, and bullets shed together might give them the upper hand in these negotiations. On the other, there were few men who knew just how brutal of a negotiator Bruno could be than the men sitting on the Hungarian side. In fact, the man who had proclaimed himself king of Hungary was one of such men, having served beneath Bruno's operational authority during the Balkan theater of the Great War. General Artur Ars von Strassenberg, despised the German-sounding surname, was a Hungarian national and one of the better generals of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, both in this life and the previous one Bruno had come from. Granted, when you're dealing with relatively disastrous leadership, that's not the greatest claim to fame, but it was one nonetheless. Because of this, he looked cautiously at Bruno, who was sitting silently in his seat, having heard both sides air their grievances in excess before finally coming to a conclusion on how to proceed. He was quiet, a bit too quiet as he sat there almost as still as a marble statue, until finally Bruno sighed and shook his head before giving voice to his thoughts. I see no other alternative to this problem other than to partition the land into thirds. The Hungarian regions will go to Hungary in an autonomous province, while the Romanian lands will go to Romania. As for the lands primarily inhabited by Germans in between, they will become a small, independent duchy whose independence is guaranteed by the German Reich. The treaty will stipulate that free trade is to spread across the region, and that no military bases, occupation, or garrisons are to take place in the small German neutral zone. If you both agree to lay down your arms and retreat into your own regions, I will guarantee the Tyrolean crown backs the region with investment into infrastructure upgrades, including agriculture, as I know you are all desperate for my machinery. Do we have a deal? This was not a solution that either party had come to the table expecting. Partitioning Transylvania into thirds, with a German buffer zone in between, acting as the peaceful wall between them. It was undesirable on the surface for both sides. However, if there was anything the failure of the Austro-Hungarian Empire taught them, it would be that annexing and integrating foreign populations into their territory would cause a far larger headache than it was worth. With that said, and the promise of German investment into their lacking infrastructure and agricultural sector, this offer became a lot more appealing to those who were present to bear witness to the proposal. Thus, after some extensive thinking, a formal treaty was drafted, airtight, and without loopholes to be exploited by either side. And in the end it was signed by all parties, including Bruno himself, who acted as witness and arbitrator over what would become known as the Tyrolean Accords. Though Bruno did not realize it yet, his ability to settle what was perhaps the most complicated and bloody partitioning of land since the Schleswig-Holstein question in the previous century would give him enormous prestige across Europe as a man who had a mind beyond simply slaughter. It was a treaty that would echo across Europe as a testament to Bruno's vision, not just as a warrior, but as a statesman. He didn't realize it at the time, but this would be the moment the European press began calling him not the Wolf of Prussia, but the Lion of Tyrol, a beast no less dangerous, but one cloaked now in majesty, authority, and imperial calm. The Mutt had become a monarch. Chapter 436, The Weight of the World. Across the Atlantic, a storm was brewing near the Rio Grande, a river that served as a natural barrier between the United States and the Latin world beyond it. Border skirmishes had been flaring up for the past few years, the most infamous of which came when Pancho Villa dared to lead incursions into U.S. territory. But in this timeline, the United States was not the burgeoning global military-industrial titan it had begun to resemble in the latter half of the 19th century. Teddy Roosevelt's ambitions of forging a world-striding American empire had been stillborn, smothered by his more isolationist successors. Once again, the electorate had chosen withdrawal over expansion. While American markets cautiously reopened to the world, its overseas colonies were increasingly seen as burdensome relics, especially with domestic concerns mounting along the Mexican border. Ironically, it was after the Berlin Olympics and the resolution of the Hungarian-Romanian conflict that even the most isolationist corners of the U.S. administration began to feel the sting of irrelevance. The world was moving forward, and it was doing so without them. This was the core of American hubris, the illusion that it had ever been equal to the European empires. It wasn't. Not until 1945, when a different post-war world let America rise from the ashes mostly untouched. But here, in 1918, the United States was more of a backwater than even Russia. Full of potential, yes, but it remained a vast, lumbering adolescent, strong in body, untested in soul. That potential, however, was nearing ignition. The American-controlled Philippines faced two looming threats. First, the Empire of Japan, which had seized much of Southeast Asia during the Great War and now stared hungrily at the islands. Second, the rising tide of revolutionary sentiment within. The Philippine insurrection had ended less than 25 years ago, but its embers still smoldered. With British and French colonies around the world erupting in flames, talk of renewed revolution in Manila was no longer theoretical. This time, however, things were different. The Pacific was flooded with surplus arms after the war. Smuggling weaponry into the Philippines wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And soon, the cries for freedom might once again be matched with steel and fire. From afar, Bruno watched. Thoughtfully, quietly. The way he saw it, there were only two possible scenarios to arise from this inevitability. A full-scale insurrection might push the United States to retreat from its Pacific holdings. Or, if he were particularly unlucky, the war might compel them to militarize, industrialize, and become the very threat Bruno remembered from his past life. Either way, his hands were tied. With decolonization in Middle Africa already underway, Bruno could hardly condemn anti-colonial uprisings elsewhere, especially not while funding one behind closed doors. The risk of exposure outweighed any reward. And so he could only sit in his study, gazing at the globe resting near the corner of his desk. He spun it once, slowly, as if trying to divine the future from its axis. A long sigh escaped his lips. Then he reached into a drawer and retrieved a folder marked with a red tab. Inside was a photograph. Pancho Villa, rifle in hand, grinning like a bandit king. The man who had dragged the United States Army into the Mexican Revolution, a war that had been raging since 1910. Bruno knew what history held, a slow collapse of Mexico into factional chaos. But he also knew that Germany's werewolf group, its covert paramilitary mercenaries, could not act unilaterally in the Americas, not without provoking the Monroe Doctrine and the full force of American retaliation. Still, options remained. Bruno ultimately reached nearby into his desk drawer where he found a bottle of vodka, gifted to him by the Tsar himself during his last visit to Russia. By now it was a quarter empty. In past years, this battle would have been done and gone within the span of a week. Now it had persisted for months, perhaps even close to a year, with only the slightest sign of its clear liquid within vanishing. Still, if there was ever a time, a need, for a nice stiff drink, now was the moment to do so. Bruno opened up his miniature ice chest he kept within his office to keep his beverages nice and cool. He plucked a few cubes and put them neatly in his glass before filling it with vodka. After taking a single sip of the clean and crisp liquid, one so smooth it might as well have been water, Bruno reached for the rotary phone on his desk. He dialed a number he had memorized, but never used. It rang. Once. Twice. On the fifth ring, a secretary answered. Bruno introduced himself. Ever so briefly, the need for extensive introductions was something of the distant past. The simple utterance of his identity was more than enough to make a room go silent. And this proved to be the case when the line instantly became very quiet on the other end. Moments later, however, he heard a voice he didn't recognize, but one he knew belonged to the President of the United States. "I'm surprised to hear from you. From what my delegation reported, you had no interest in speaking with us while we were in Berlin. So, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Bruno didn't mince words. His voice was cool, direct. "I was wondering what you were planning to do about the violence just south of your borders. Because, if the price is right, I know of a group of professionals who could end that situation, however you wish it to end." There was silence on the other end. A long one. The president had never expected Bruno von Zehntner to call him personally, certainly not on the Oval Office's private line. And he most certainly didn't expect him to offer a mercenary solution to a war that Washington had already begun planning for, grudgingly, reluctantly, and with full awareness of the PR disaster that would follow. But this was off the books. Clean, deniable, and eerily convenient. "Go on," the president said. And so Bruno did. Chapter 437, Belligerent and Insufferable. For a brief moment, Bruno took a sip from his glass. He did not say a word, not at first, almost as if he was deeply contemplating his thoughts, until finally he did, and when he finally chose to speak, he did so with the weight and gravitas of a mythic figure, a Greek titan, gazing down at the mortals below and giving them his divine command. "Let's cut to the chase. The war on your border? How much will it cost you to wage it yourself? Whether it's the act of making sure your factories are scaled up to produce the weapons and munitions necessary to properly arm and supply the new divisions you will have to mobilize, or the housing, feeding, and training of your new conscripts themselves. It would be an enormous expense on behalf of the American taxpayer to field an army to deal with your troublesome neighbors by yourselves. And let's face it, currently, as the way it stands, your people are in a state of indecisiveness. They would be hard-pressed to justify such a campaign of violence when their sons, fathers, and brothers start returning in caskets. Meanwhile, your Congress will be difficult to convince mobilization of an actual armed force is necessary to secure your southern border and the people who are living there. Mexico is, after all, a threat far away from the ivory towers of Washington. What do the rich men north of Richmond know of the plight so far away from their mansions? And even if you do manage to get congressional approval for all of this, how long will it take you to actually send an army south? A year? 2? Will the war be over by then? And who will emerge victorious without your interference? Let's take a second to analyze where your current predicament will inevitably lead if things continue as they have been for some time now. No, not tomorrow, not a week nor a month, or even a year from now, but decades. From the report sitting on my desk, the situation is so complicated I cannot even begin to explain it to someone in a brief summary. There are factions loyal to different figureheads who, for the last 8 years, have been backstabbing and shooting one another in the streets. It seems one major player switches sides every year or two. So let's get down to what needs to be done to end the violence on your borders, which has now crossed into your territory and killed your people. You need someone in Mexico, one of the many figures who is willing to cooperate with you and restore order. And you need men to arm, train, and supply him without any official ties to your nation. After all, plausible deniability is key to your security here. Muster your army for border protection and leave the more morally ambiguous actions to professionals who can be contracted for the right price. It just so happens to be that I know a group of such people. Through passing, of course. These aren't exactly dinner guests or friends of the family, if you get what I mean. A friend of a friend knows the number to call, though. If you were to contract these men for your southern ambitions, they would likely be able to guarantee you a brand new militant faction in Mexico that is wholly supportive to the idea of restoring law, order, and constitution to Mexico, as well as working with the United States for future interests in the region, not as a rival or adversary, but as a friend and ally can have at least gained a footing capable of standing on their own. And in 5 years maximum, this new faction, with the support of your contractors subtly hiding in the background, will have fully restored law and order in Mexico. Now what precisely they do after that point will be entirely up to you and yours to figure out. The President of the United States thought about Bruno's offer for a moment in silence. He had heard a word of Werewolf Group and its ties to the German Reich. Though Germany denied having anything to do with the mercenary troop, it was obvious they were being armed, trained, and supplied by the German Ministry of Defense. But this was a miscalculation on the world's part, and Bruno had revealed who was truly pulling the strings of Ernst Röhm and his war band of battle-hardened war criminals. Bruno was the Shadow Monarch, a man whose image was so prestigious within the German sphere of influence over the idea that he was personally funding and sanctioning this mercenary horde was inconceivable to most who heard it. But Bruno was also a clever man, one with a full understanding of the English tongue. He was far smarter than the President of the United States had previously given him credit for, and that only now became apparent as he posed an offer that, while never outright admitting control of it, was in his hands. From what it sounded like, Bruno was offering to give him a phone number of a friend who might happen to be able to get the President in touch with the leader of Werewolf Group. In no way were there any words spoken by Bruno that could connect him directly to the mercenaries who had become infamous for brutality in the Balkans and in Middle Africa. After recognizing all of this, the man could not help but be impressed with how easily and naturally Bruno verbally outmaneuvered anyone he was speaking with, and was quick to admit defeat in a way that continued the negotiation. Let's say I do this. I accept this offer you are proposing. How will this work? What precisely will I need to do? Bruno, now have tossed the bait in front of the American president and hooked him, was quick to reel him in, slowly, carefully, and gingerly in order to ensure the line didn't snap under immense pressure. Simply look the other way towards any intelligence that suggests foreign assets being deployed to the region. And of course sign the contract handing over the necessary agreed-upon payment, which you will have to broker with the man in charge of this group once I get you in touch with them. They will handle the rest, from logistics, to training, to coordinating combat operations. You won't have to worry about another thing. All you will have to do on your part is to mobilize the U.S. Army to protect your border to ensure none of the violence continues to spill into your territory and keeps affecting your people. The price will probably be steep, but far more reasonable than handling all of this yourself, and will keep your hands clean in the eyes of the public. America simply protected its borders and didn't act in an imperialistic and militaristic fashion towards its underdeveloped southern neighbors. Meanwhile, Mexico settled their own matters in-house, and just so happened to end with a man in power who is pro-Washington. A rather beautiful version of the story once it is told to the public, don't you think? Once more, the President of the United States was truly in awe at the utter shamelessness in how Bruno spoke about complex black operations and manipulation of the truth for public relations. The man not only seemed like he was 13 places ahead on the chessboard, but that he had the experience of a grandmaster while doing it. And when he came to understand this, the President of the United States also came to realize just why the Allied powers had been so brutally beaten by Germany and their allies during the Great War. They were dealing with a genius not only in military matters, but one who was operating on a battlefield set 100 years in the future. And what kind of monster was necessary to contend with such a man? If he could even be compared to a mortal in the first place, that is. Having thought all of this through, the President of the United States sighed heavily before selling his soul to the devil, just like so many other powerful and influential men had done before. All right, you get me in touch with these men, and if the price is right, I will ensure it's paid according to whatever contract we sign. Although I have to say, you are quite different from how the boys in Washington speak of you. Bruno, perhaps intrigued by the last part of what the president had admitted to him, was quick to chuckle as he finished off his glass of vodka, before finally responding with a tone that intentionally heightened the curiosity in his voice. Oh, really now? And what, pray tell, is the perception these men have of me? The president seemed to be silently squirming on the other end of the line, as if he felt stupid for opening his mouth about such a subject. But after a while a resigned tone erupted on the other end of the line along with a mere 3 words which encapsulated the American view of Bruno entirely. Belligerent and insufferable. Chapter 438, A New Era of Naval Dominance. It did not take much to secure the patronage of the United States. The Werewolf Group had a fearsome reputation, as both mercenaries who operated without any verifiable ties to their employers, and with impeccable results nonetheless. The price was hefty, but as Bruno pointed out, it was significantly cheaper than the cost of raising entire new divisions and equipping them with an invasion of Mexico. It also was an option completely devoid of any political baggage that would normally come with such a thing. And within weeks, the first werewolf mercenaries arrived on Mexico's soil, acting as foreign advisors and agents of foreign internal defense more than anything else. At least on paper, that is. Underneath the surface, however, their primary purpose was to foster a local militant faction that was pro-Washington and would be operating under the order of the United States Department of Defense. As a result, Bruno had played the best hand he could within the realm of the Americas, which were under strict defense, reinforced by the Monroe Doctrine, and he had convinced the American government to foot the bill. Bruno was a man of his word, and one way or another the war would be won within the next few years, hopefully creating a solid, stable, Mexican government that chose to work within the American sphere of influence, and preferably keep the United States grounded in their own region, rather than needlessly butting their nose in where it didn't belong. Thus, Bruno's attention turned elsewhere, with developments being made in regards to the introduction of turboprop aircraft, and the E-series of tanks and armored vehicles slowly being scaled up to their maximum reasonable size, and all variations needed to fulfill early combined arms battalions. Bruno instead shifted his focus to the much-neglected version of Germany's war development. Or he should say, much neglected in preparation for the previous war, but now was a large focus of his. Bruno's shipyards in Danzig had gained extensive experience over the last decade building submarines and destroyers, and their knowledge of developing and manufacturing warships was now second only to the major German shipyards. But now Bruno had something else planned, and to first build this next generation of warships, he had to first change the mentality of the Kaiserlich Marine on a doctrinal level. Hence why he used his power and influence to summon the highest members of the German Admiralty. Bruno's relationship with these men was complicated to say the least. On the one hand, Many of them were very displeased with the fact that Bruno had taken the spotlight in Germany's victory during the Great War. After all, the army seemed to receive most of, if not all, the credit for Germany's dominating victory, while the Navy played a significant but largely forgotten role in the overall result of the conflict. Not to mention Bruno was still at odds with the old guard of Germany's ancient and wealth aristocratic families, many of whom held prominent positions in the Navy. Because of this, those men did not bother attending the meeting, drawing a line in the sand between themselves and those who did. Still, old alliances died hard, and the ties Bruno had forged early on to now Grand Admiral Henning von Holzendorf had paid off in full, and then some. While being granted recognition for his use in developing Wolfpack tactics, Henning had made it known to those fellow admirals he could count on that the idea was truly Bruno's, and that if he was gathering admirals, they needed to shut up, attend, and listen, because his ideas of warfare weren't just revolutionary for ground and aerial forces, but naval assets as well. Frankly speaking, Bruno hadn't seen the old admiral in many years, and if he was being honest with himself, this might be his last chance to do so, as the man died in 1919 during his previous life, which was just a year away from the current date, if even. Even so, he was surprised to see the man bow his head in front of him the moment he made contact, apologizing for a matter Bruno had forgotten about entirely. General Feldmarschall, no, Your Royal Highness. I must apologize. I tried to block the seizure of the fleet of landing craft you had personally sponsored the creation of, but I was overruled at the time by the remainder of the Admiralty. As penance, I have admitted the truth to these men, that you were the founder of Wolfpack doctrine that helped our Navy defeat the British so dominantly during the Great War, and they are eager to hear whatever you have to say because of it. I know it isn't much, and in no way pays you back for the failures I have made, but please know it is all I can offer at this time. Bruno, a bit dumbfounded, albeit thankful for the gesture, was quick to help the aging admiral up to his feet, so he could properly stand upright, while informing him there was no pardon necessary to be granted. Please, stand, you have no reason to bow before me. I never once held you responsible for the short-sighted foolishness of those old fossils. You truly have no reason to go to such extent to seek my forgiveness. Besides, we have something much more important to discuss, and I wanted to hear your earnest opinion in that regard, one unburdened by some self-perceived of guilt, and rather granted to me with the clarity I have always trusted you with. The murmurs were subtle but noticeable. The other admirals were indeed surprised Bruno showed such grace to a Grand Admiral of the Kaiserlich Marine, when many thought he might be holding a grudge over what one could consider the theft of a fortune's worth of ships. Bruno, however, didn't really care all that much about such a petty past grievance. Was it a foolish act on behalf of the Admiralty, hoping to use his ships to invade the British Isles? An invasion that never manifested itself in reality? Did it at all change the course of his campaign in the Balkans? Not in the slightest. The result was the same either way. Because of this, Bruno had already forgotten about such a matter. But the Kaiserlich Marine hadn't, and they were beyond grateful to see the way which Bruno handled it. As a result, the men who gathered today were far more inclined to genuinely listen to what Bruno had to speak of. And Bruno did not surprise them, as he pulled out a board with some partially drawn schematics on it, explaining in great detail his vision for the future of the German Navy. We all know the role that torpedo bombers played in the Battle of the North Sea, but biplanes are already rapidly becoming obsolete, and seaplanes? Forget about them entirely. So, we aren't relying on such primitive measures. How do we deploy our planes going into the future? The answer is in warships deliberately designed to carry airframes and launch them at sea. Naturally, these carriers will be escorted by ships capable of screening against all forms of attack and providing protection against them, such as anti-aircraft, anti-submarine, and anti-battleship. But gentlemen, this is the future of our Navy, as you can see in this primitive layout. In such a setup, and deployed in such numbers, not only will these carrier strike groups, as I have decided to name them, prove lethal against enemy battleships, but can even provide support to amphibious landings. Bruno would spend the next hour explaining in great detail how these ships functioned, how many planes they could carry, how they would maintain logistical supply, what they would be escorted by, where they would be built, anchored, etc. And by the time he had finished his presentation, the German admirals were staring at the man as if he were some kind of mad prophet. Bruno had just declared in full detail more or less how the next generation of naval warfare would operate, and had proven with a practical model that the age of the dreadnought and battleship class of vessels was already vastly obsolete, other than perhaps as classic gunships utilized solely for coastal bombardments. A fortune had been spent on these weapon platforms, and aside from one major engagement, they had never even truly been utilized to their fullest potential. It was not only a devastating realization, but also deeply enlightening. And it was all proposed by an army field marshal, and not a naval admiral. And while Henning simply sat there with a smug, "I told you so" expression on his weathered face, the other admirals who had accompanied him sat in genuine bewilderment as they tried to wrap their heads around everything that was happening right now. While they were still trying to figure it out, Henning stood up and made a bold proposition, one that would forever change the course of German naval doctrine, or at least for the next century. "Well, after everything I just witnessed, I can make you this solemn vow. Even if it is the last thing I do in this life, I will make sure this vision of yours is adopted as the premier naval doctrine going forward. And I'll be damned if those old vampires stop me this time." Bruno couldn't help but smirk as he shook the Grand Admiral's hand. Having known the man for many years now, he couldn't help but understand his resolve and know that he would keep his vow even if it killed him. And so Germany began the long path towards developing true global projection capabilities. Chapter 439, Twilight of the Bloodlines. Bruno had unintentionally climbed the social, political, and economic ladder of the German Reich within a period of 20 years. He was now sitting at a position that was damn near untouchable. He wasn't just a monarch in his own right, answering directly to the Kaiser, but he was a war hero who every political party worth a damn would literally kill just to have him publicly endorse them. His wealth? Few men in the history of mankind could come close to all that he had accomplished. The public adored him, the sword and shield of the Reich, a man who, no matter how high he grew, never forgot his duty to the people. And his wife had long since been referred to as the Angel of Berlin for the aid she gave to the wounded soldiers, homeless, orphans, and just the general downtrodden in life. Truly within the borders of the fatherland, there was one type of citizen who despised Bruno, the ancient vampires who clung to their old power like it was their lifeline, one that was rapidly drying up. Prussia had been among the first European states to adopt meritocracy, and as a result the German Empire had inherited this mentality in military affairs, to be sure. But Bruno had made it a precedent to everything in life. Military, politics, business. If you couldn't succeed by your own virtue as a man, then you didn't deserve the prestige, respect, and wealth that came with it. The old aristocracy was now forced to kneel to the new Tyrolean prince, one whose own daughters would be married to the future Kaiser and Tsar alike. Meanwhile, they began to falter in relevance. And while this had been something put on the back pedal because of the war effort, as the years began to pass, and the scars of the Great War began to heal in a way that made it slip into history more than memory, these ancient bloodlines began to realize that their fundamental way of life was not on a sacrificial altar. Bruno had built a society that no longer needed them, nor respected them, at least by virtue of their heritage. Rather, it demanded they continuously perform in accordance with their position and the expectations demanded of it. This, to a privileged class of people who had been resting on the laurels of greater ancestors so far distant removed from the current generations, they might as well have been antediluvian in origin, meant that they did not wish to integrate into this world where nobility was once more tied to duty. Their ancestors had paid their dues long ago to earn their noble status, so why then should they be expected to continue to pay such a price? And that was the fundamental flaw with nobility as an institution, or as it was prior to the changes Prussia was already working towards by the middle of the 19th century. Even without Bruno's interference, this rot and decay was being cut out, cleansed and replaced by a new generation of noble warriors, scientists, and industrialists who had earned their dues with sacrifice, honor, and merit. But this new kind of monarchic society had been crushed before it could truly flourish, only brought back to life in this new timeline as a result of Bruno's interference. And now he would have to deal with the specters of the past, which sought to continue to leech off the lifeblood of the Reich and its institutions. It was no wonder that many of them were now gathered together in a palace within the Bavarian Alps. The great Bavarian King Ludwig II had built this palace, and its fantastical design had been the inspiration for most works of fantasy in the 20th and 21st centuries. Neuschwanstein Castle was truly a work of beauty, an envy of the world when it came to the grandeur of architecture in a way few other structures could ever compete with, and was so far removed from the centers of power it had managed to emerge nearly unmolested by the wrath and folly of 2 world wars and the generations which waged them. At least in Bruno's past life, that is. Now, here today in 1918, it was the center of a gathering of ancient noblemen, dressed in extensive uniforms, with medals more gained from nepotism than through actual service, as they sat and discussed how to hold on to their waning influence and deal with the man they held responsible for it. A familiar face was here, albeit far older and more haggard than the last time Bruno had seen decades ago. No, it was not Heidi's father. The man had passed away some time in 1909, and she had been prevented from attending the funeral altogether by her scornful half-siblings. Rather, the man who sat in this meeting, listening to his older brother negotiate with other ancient families on personal petty matters prior to discussing joint cooperation in bringing Bruno down, was none other than the foolish Prince of Lippe, who had challenged Bruno to a duel over the offense of striking his woman. Bruno had humiliated this man in front of the Kaiser and half of Germany's upper nobility. A lowly junker's son had left scars across his body and face so horrific they had never even begun to fade with the passing of time. Unlike the scar on Bruno's own face having been earned with pride and honor during academic fencing, these were wounds of a man trounced in a duel by a far younger adolescent boy and in a challenge over the honor of a bastard girl. Julius had never forgotten this humiliation, but while he basked in the wealth and luxury of his family's fortune, Bruno had built himself into a titan of a man, one with the wealth, power, respect, and alliances to stand among the world's greatest men. How could Julius ever avenge this insult that had been permanently cut into his flesh as a daily reminder of his own mediocrity? Most certainly never by his lonesome, but this was a gathering of powerful and ancient forces. His wife Clara had aged far worse than her younger half-sister. Heidi had been blessed by Kronos, as time itself seemed to only kiss her cheeks as it passed by, providing age in the most graceful of areas, while still maintaining the vibrance and beauty of a woman a decade younger. Clara, however, looked like Father Time hit her over the face with the book, easily 5 to 10 years older in appearance, and she really was. Having to see her bastard sister, who she used to torment as a child for being too pretty, being referred to by the public, and even her own sons as Berlin's angel, was a deeply infuriating blow to her ego as the lawful daughter of their father. For all of her life, she could lord over the fact over Heidi that she was still a true princess at the end of the day. But then came Bruno's rise to power in Russia, in Austria, and in Germany. Heidi wasn't just a princess born of royal blood, albeit a bastard of passion. No, she was a genuine grand princess, royal consort to the newly crowned Grand Prince of Tyrol, an actual monarch beneath the Kaiser, rather than a mere mediatized prince whose royalty was in name only. She too could not hide her contempt for the discussion being had by the members of their own families who wielded the actual authority to do something about Bruno. But they were cautious. Too cautious, so much so they appeared to even fear the very idea of expressing ill will towards the Lion of Tyrol aloud, despite how much they internally felt the very sentiment with every fiber of their being. Julius and Clara naturally knew their place here, but seeing these old men use alternative terms, stepping around the blatant issue they were here to discuss in the first place, only tested their patience. However, ultimately, it was one of the princes of Bavaria, the host of this meeting, who spoke his thoughts out loud. He was not the current reigning king of Bavaria, or even the rightful heir, yet he had the gall to use his family's possessions to summon this treasonous meeting. And because of this, he could no longer sit by and watch these old men refuse to address his reason for doing so. Let's just say it as it is, and stop avoiding the issue entirely, shall we? Bruno von Zehntner must die. There's no other way to say it. If he is killed now, the Kaiser and Tsar can be convinced to break the engagements that have been proposed between the man's daughters and their future successors. But the longer we wait, and certainly the longer we avoid the topic altogether, the quicker this window of opportunity will slip us by. Because if we continue to do nothing, then our time will truly come to an end, here and now. And I am unwilling to go quietly into the night, even if my family has chosen peace with the so-called Wolf of Prussia. So cast your lots and be done with it." Silence permeated the air for a long time, as few had the nerve to step forward and agree with such an incendiary statement. Chapter 440. The Trap at Neuschwanstein. Bruno's eyes and ears were everywhere in the Reich. Nearly 20 years of seizing power and control over intelligence networks, or building them from scratch, had given him an unprecedented level of access to threats inside and outside the Reich's borders, to himself, to his plans, and most importantly, to his family. And there were always those among the ranks of the discontented who knew that selling out their comrades could secure a better outcome for themselves. The fact that a lower prince of the von Wittelsbach dynasty had orchestrated a little meeting did not go unnoticed by Bruno's agents. Not one bit. In fact, it was the King of Bavaria himself who alerted Bruno to what one of his distant relatives was plotting within the halls of a family palace. Not just as a way to bury the hatchet between their ancient lineages, or the wrongs done to Heidi in her youth, but also to reassure Bruno that the royal house of Bavaria had no part in the conspiracy. Bruno's response was simple: "This is your house. Put it in order as you see fit." And that was the end of it, at least from Bruno's perspective. However, the moment the young prince said the words, "Bruno von Zehntner must die," silence followed. Then, one by one, the other aggrieved old houses threw their lot in. An agreement was made, witnessed not just by one another, but by hidden operatives of King Ludwig III. Retribution didn't come with the crash of glass or the roar of flashbangs. No elite forces rappelled from the windows. Instead, it came with boots, polished, deliberate, clacking across the tile. And then King Ludwig III himself appeared. There was no sneer, no smirk, just cold judgment. His tone was as dreadful as the expression on his face. "Pardon my intrusion, but it would appear I was not invited to this little gathering in the comfort of my own home. Now, what are we discussing here today? Conspiracy to commit regicide? Acts of high treason? I've heard enough to know that you're all guilty." He raised his hand. "I, King Ludwig III of the House von Wittelsbach, hereby order the arrest of everyone present, and the investigation of your houses for the crimes so plainly spoken of today in my domain. Guards, arrest these fools." Panic broke out instantly. The conspirators shouted and blamed one another. Armed guards in regal Bavarian uniforms stormed into the room and began securing the nobles. "You damn bastards. Of course, it would be a minor prince from some insignificant domain like Lippe that betrayed us," shouted one. Julius, having been kicked to the floor and tied up, howled in fury. "Liar! Don't you dare slander at my house. You're just groveling now to save your own skin." His wife, Clara, shrieked as she was dragged away. "How dare you accuse my ancient lineage of scandal? This is all lies. I'll see you hanged, you traitor." Ludwig III, now visibly weary of watching grown men and women behave like children, sighed deeply. "You're all going to hang, you damned fools," he muttered. And just like that, the weight of their situation fell on them. Whatever fury they had toward one another was extinguished. Fear replaced it. Then, the young prince, the same one who had summoned the conspiracy, was brought before King Ludwig. But rather than being forced to his knees, he dropped out of his own accord, revealing himself as the bait. "Your Highness," he said, head bowed, "did I perform the task to your satisfaction?" For the first time since entering the room, Ludwig III allowed himself a brief smile. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You exceeded my expectations. You have a bright future in intelligence. We've rooted out the last remnants of a bygone age. Men who would rather destroy the Reich than see it move forward. You played your part perfectly." Then, raising his voice, "This one is to be released. The rest, send them to holding. We'll wait on the Kaiser's permission to search their estates." The final obstacle in Bruno's path, those clinging to privilege by blood alone, had been removed. The ancient vampires were no more. And the future? It belonged to those who earned it. Bruno was notified of the successful operation in the same way he had granted permission to conduct it, a single sentence, on a secure line, between two monarchs. And after hanging up, he dialed another number entirely. It was the line of Grand Admiral Henning von Holzendorf. The admiral was slightly surprised to hear from Bruno so soon after their last meeting. He was already planning how to deal with the admirals of the old guard who stubbornly refused to give ground to new doctrine, which, unproven, came from a reliable source. But when he heard Bruno's voice across the other line, he was stunned into utter silence, still as the dead as he stood there waiting, almost for something more than the simple phrase he was told. Our obstacles have been dealt with accordingly. Proceed with the introduction of the new doctrine we have planned, and make the necessary preparations to design and develop the new fleets. I will be waiting to hear from you once you have made some progress in this regard. And then there was a click, nothing more, nothing less. The orders had been given, and though Henning was not below Bruno in terms of authority in the slightest, somehow, someway he still moved to fulfill them without the slightest hesitation or afterthought. The old world had truly died on this night, not in glorious fire and fury, but silently in the darkness, the last flame of resistance from a distant era forever extinguished, never to return. The trap which had been laid at Neuschwanstein would never become a matter of public record, the crimes committed by these houses forgotten entirely within a generation of two. And those who remained standing within these ancient dynasties would never recover to a point where they could ever challenge the new order again, nor would they have any desire to. Chapter 441. The Ashes of Veracruz. Ash, soot, and the embers of a dying fire were all that remained of the scene. That, and the bodies littered throughout its landscape. It was as if something apocalyptic had happened here. The reality? War? For the last 8 years, the nation of Mexico had been embroiled in revolution, and the longer it went on, the more unstable things became. It seemed every day now that an assassination of some kind occurred, which prompted an even more violent response from another warlord. The reality was this wasn't some organized civil war between government forces and revolutionaries. Warlords came and went, and the men fighting were loyal to them, not the banners they waved at any given moment. Sure, it was painted in the light of a more traditional civil war, but this matter was far from simple. And now, a new banner was waving over the ashes of Veracruz. Armed militiamen wearing black armbands with a skull and a sombrero on its head were executing anyone who still had some breath left. Not with a shot to the skull, but a bayonet to the heart. Ammunition wasn't cheap, especially since it was mostly being imported across the sea by the German Reich. In the background was the leader of this latest war band, Colonel Rafael Olivares. Part revolutionary, part cowboy, part factory worker. Olivares was a former officer of the Mexican army who had spent the last 8 years of his life fighting for whoever he thought posed the greatest chance at order and stability within the region. But as things continued to descend into chaos, and when Washington had reached its breaking point, he was quick to accept their offer as becoming their man in the field, their boots on the ground. Hell, even their puppet. Because nothing else seemed to be working, and things were only getting worse with each passing day. The man's face was concealed by a black tattered bandana, whose skull print on its onyx fabric had already begun to fade with wear. Above his suit vest, which he wore without a blazer and rolled sleeves, was a brown leather bandolier over his chest, containing 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser stripper clips. Ammo. His Winchester 1895 was chambered to fire. It was a rifle reminiscent of a dying era. While modern militaries had already begun transitioning to semi-automatic weapons, these guerrillas reached into the past, choosing pragmatism over progress. They needed something reliable, rugged, and forgiving. The old days of the Wild West were long gone, but in Mexico, through the burning ruins of Veracruz, that spirit lived on in steel and smoke. The rifle itself had been contracted from the Winchester Company in the United States, rechambered in the German standard issue 7.92 by 57 mm round. It was built for the Sons of Liberty, pro-Washington guerrillas fighting a war not for territory, but for control over chaos. These weapons were modified with more militant fittings, and with the ability to accept standard Mauser 98 stripper clips, of which Germany had an abundance of leftover from their pre-war stockpiles. Ammunition flooded the country in cardboard boxes, contained in 5-round clips, that were handed to the guerrillas to use in the rifles that were brought down from the U.S. border, and they had been used to great effect here in Veracruz. Who exactly held the city before now didn't really matter because nobody was on the side of the group calling themselves Los Hijos de la Libertad, otherwise known in English as the Sons of Liberty. But to those who were forced to feel the sting of their wrath, they were simply known as Los Calaveras Negros, the Black Skulls, due to their own custom banner and armbands, which was a nod to their secretive German trainers. Olivares slung his rifle and pulled his revolver out of its holster attached to his waistbelt, which contained small hooks for his speed loaders. Chambered in .45 ACP, this M1917 revolver was supplied to him by the U.S. Army and was the standard sidearm of the Black Skulls. The man smoked a cigarette in his mouth as he ensured that all rounds were properly loaded before pulling back the hammer. As he took a drag from his cigarette, he looked over at the man next to him who, despite being dressed like a local, seemed oddly out of place in the region. Flawless white skin, golden hair and brows, and was not dressed like a guerrilla but a businessman. He was an officer of the Werewolf Group, sent to Mexico to train and guide these men, and he had been doing so for months now. Olivares took one look at the man, before asking in near-perfect German if he should interrogate the prisoner forced to kneel in front of him by his men before executing him. "Are you sure I should put this feral dog down so soon? He might have valuable intelligence we could use to learn about the enemy." However, the German veteran simply scoffed and shook his head before looking over at the prisoner and choosing to speak in Spanish instead, so that the man knew exactly what they were discussing. Interrogate him? And what would he tell us that we don't already know? Every player, major or otherwise in the state of Mexico, is now your enemy. The revolutionaries and the would-be dictators fighting for a dead government, one they killed with their stupidity. You know where the enemy is. You know how many men they have. You simply need to take what is rightfully yours. Put this cur down already and let us move on to the next target, because all of this, every flame, every corpse, it's just a message. Nothing more. Nothing less. Olivares remained silent as he took one last drag of his cigarette, staring directly at his handler before throwing it away. And as he flicked the used up butt to the side, he pulled the trigger at the same time, blowing the brains of the prisoner out of the back of his skull and leaving his body to be feasted upon by the carrions. After which he shouted orders to his men. "Grab what you can. We're not staying long. Daylight won't wait for us, and there are more men to kill yet." The werewolf officer didn't take a second glance at the POW who was executed right in front of him without the slightest care of the man who pulled the trigger, because this was the cost of business, and his business was war. And at the end of the day, there was no business more secure to be invested in than war, because there was always one to fight somewhere at some time. So long as humans remained, there would be war, and Veracruz was just the latest wreckage left in its senseless wake of violence. Chapter 442. On the march again. It had been years since the French Republic collapsed and entered a state of poverty, anarchy, and war. But today, for better or worse, France breathed again. The Gallian militia had finally seized the last holdout of the nation's largest province. Corpses of revolutionaries lie dead in the streets and the countryside as Paris stood in the distance, more ravaged and weary than prideful and jubilant. But to the people who had endured, who had lived through the pain and suffering, like the French soldiers wearing their old uniforms now stained with mud, blood, and oil beyond recognition, they didn't truly celebrate in recognition of this victory. Rather, they smoked cigarettes and cracked open wine as they lamented the cost of it. Whether it was the 2 brutal and bloody years of the Great War, or the following 2 years of civil war and anarchy, Paris had been liberated, and the countryside outside its gates was in a similar state. Meanwhile, militias across the country had done the same. France was beginning to see some form of order rebuilt from the ashes of the Third Republic. But while these loosely connected militias had wiped out what remained of the French Reds, there was a new problem to face. Various strongmen, like Charles de Gaulle, had risen to prominence among these differing groups, none specifically bound by any particular ideology or obligation, simply a desire to restore order to the lawless and chaotic French homeland. Some were sneering imperialist types, others were hardcore liberals with a patriotic sense of duty, while there were those who felt the military, or what remained of it, should be in charge of the nation and its people. The French monarchy had failed under the Bourbons, and what remained of the royal bloodline had long since fled the country, either during the Reign of Terror or whatever the hell this madness that befell the Republic after it had collapsed under the weight of its own hubris. As for Marxism and all of its derivatives, simply gaze upon the ashes of Paris and the million dead souls within it, and your answer for whether or not it was a suitable ideology lies with them. The violence it began with Marxist revolutionaries taking advantage of a collapsing state, one that was already in a state of crisis from the Great War, and it had transcended into something so brutal. Even Bruno wept when he learned of what had happened to Versailles. Figuratively speaking, of course, but it was a propaganda piece that was painted by a particularly pro-German French newspaper showing the Wolf of Prussia having a single tear of blood drop down his cheeks as he and his men withdrew from Paris as part of the treaty's stipulations. There were a large number of French veterans who were once treated well by the Germans as prisoners of war, had condemned the notions of revanchism for the bloody fate of the Republic and the senseless slaughter it brought on. But they were forced to flee the country long ago. And it was a sentiment de Gaulle had thought nothing but of as he watched the nation bleed before him time and time again. The truth was, the Germans had treated him well during his time as prisoner of war, that, and his men as well. Gaulle knew these anti-revanchists weren't wrong in their understanding of who had caused the war and who rightfully held the blame. But unfortunately, the flame of hatred was easier to keep alive than the fragility of empathy. And France needed an enemy if it was going to rise from its current barren state. Someone to pin all the sins of their former politicians on. Someone to unite the other warlords and strongmen like himself behind, as the antithesis of France, the devil incarnate. Luckily, or rather unfortunately, there was one man who could easily fulfill the role without any actual distortion of the truth or propaganda being needed to convince the people he was at fault. And it was the same man who was crying tears of blood as he witnessed Paris burn while turning away from it in the tattered propaganda leaflet in de Gaulle's hands. The French stood in long silence as he gazed upon the image, and in the end he said a silent prayer, not of malice, but for forgiveness from the Lord God Almighty, because he knew what he was about to do to unify France and make it a nation worthy of fear and respect once more would surely damn him to hell. Forgive me, Lord, for I am about to sin. This man tried to save us, and now I must make him appear like he is the living avatar of your most rebellious son. It is wrong, and I know it is, but it is necessary nonetheless. After saying this, de Gaulle let the leaflet fall from his hands, watching in cold stoicism as the winds picked it up before it could hit the ground, and sent it flying well in the other direction of where Paris lay, towards the distant landscape, lands that were still inhabited by brigands and rebels, lands where the stormy skies above spoke of how dangerous they were, and how their mere existence in their current state threatened to bring upon the wrath of the heavens to Paris and its surrounding regions, which had finally, after years of bloodshed, learned some peace. A soldier walked up to de Gaulle. He was an officer by now, at least among the militiamen. His accent betrayed foreign blood, likely American. Few among the legions stood by France after the Republic fell, and most like this man stayed not for the nation itself, but de Gaulle. Where to next, boss? De Gaulle finished what remained of his cigarette before stomping out its embers, where he then turned around and looked the soldier in the face, a man whose face was as disheveled and unshaven as one might expect from a man in his position. He did not immediately speak, and instead walked past the officer, before finally speaking his thoughts aloud. Where else but Normandy? The coast must be secured, and the ports within it, or else those other bastards will win in the end. And God forbid anyone other than the Gallian militia seizes the vacant throne those old fools left behind. Not another word was spoken. The French soldiers simply ensured rations, and supplies were in proper transit, before marching off towards Normandy. A new day, a new battlefield, a new chance to spill blood. Chapter 443. The Thin Line Between Devil and Man. Bruno sat in his office chair, staring at something on his desk that would have made any other man in the world elated. Multiple briefcases stacked with banknotes. But Bruno looked dreadful, as if the very sight of this cash was blighted. He said nothing. The man who delivered the cases was given only a silent nod before being dismissed. Contrary to what one might assume, this wasn't a fortune made from criminal racketeering, at least not in the traditional sense. This was Bruno's share of the profits from the Werewolf Group and its ongoing operations around the world. War, it turned out, was a profitable business. Maybe the most profitable. Drugs might be worth more by the kilo, sure, but guns? Guns didn't need to be cut, packaged, or smuggled in balloons. You sold one crate, and an entire district could fall. That was their value, not in gold, but in fear. But Bruno wasn't just selling guns. He was selling men, trained killers with combat-tested skills. His markup was a premium, one that nations, insurgents, and collapsing empires alike were willing to pay. Because what he offered was simple, guaranteed victory. And that was a price worth more than a man's soul if his ambition was greater than his sense of wisdom. Even so, legal or not, Bruno was disgusted by the money before him. The werewolf group had always been a necessary evil in his eyes, a tool to secure Germany's future, never a means for personal enrichment. He wanted the money gone, all of it. And, as if summoned by fate itself, a voice knocked on the door and offered him an answer. Bruno, dear, there's something I wish to speak with you about. Do you have a moment? Even Heidi never entered Bruno's inner sanctum without permission. It was his personal refuge, and though she was the only one he trusted with that key, she had never used it. Which is why he answered without hesitation. It's open, sweetheart, and you know I always have time for you. The grim expression vanished the moment Heidi stepped into the room. But when her eyes fell on the briefcases, she gasped. She had known her husband was rich, obscenely so, but never once had she seen this much cash out in the open. Most of Bruno's wealth had been used to back his own private bank, which, after the war, had become the largest in the Reich. His fortune lived in vaults unseen by the light of day and those within it. Even Bruno had no idea just what his fortune looked like when stacked together in a single room. He didn't dare think about it. Gold had a way of corrupting men greater than even power. A strange occurrence, but one all too recorded throughout history, across time, space, and culture. Men had descended into madness in pursuit of gold so frequently it was a damn near biological obsession. Hence, he would never gaze upon his wealth in its entirety. But this was something else. This was paper, and lots of it. It was the figure it represented that stunned Heidi, even if the brilliance of its display was lackluster compared to what she knew they had hidden away. Bruno, what is all of this? Why isn't it in the family treasury? Bruno shut one of the briefcases and handed it to her, as if it were possessed. His voice was heavy with contempt. Blood money. Unfortunately, it's the cost of securing a future for our children, one worth living in. I want nothing to do with it. Take it to your charity. At least then, maybe the deaths it paid for will mean something. Because otherwise, I might as well burn it and have a priest exorcise its spirit. Heidi blinked. The disgust on her husband's face was almost tangible, but it didn't take her long to understand why. Bruno had made a fortune designing weapons, yes, but those were for the defense of the fatherland. The werewolf group? That was something else entirely. He had helped spread war beyond Europe, sold death wholesale to unstable regions. It had been necessary, but profit was never the point. Bruno refused to benefit from that bloodshed. That line, however small, mattered to him. It was all that separated a mortal man from a devil. And he had yet to cross that boundary, at least in accordance with his own virtues, no matter how much he had been tempted to do so repeatedly throughout the years. And Heidi understood. She didn't argue. Instead, she called for a group of servants to carry the money away, marking it for her charities. Once they were alone again, she settled into his lap, wrapped her arms around him, and whispered something only a woman like her could say with conviction. You were right to give it to me, darling. I'll make sure it helps those who truly need it. I know what you're thinking, but if people are going to profit from this business, then the least we can do is make sure your share does some good in the world. You can trust me to do that, while you carry the weight of nations. I'll carry this for you. I'll always be here for you. You only have to ask. Bruno kissed her hand, then brushed his fingers through her hair, silently grateful. She stood to leave, returning to her own responsibilities. And when Bruno was alone once more, he stared at the empty desk, sighed, and whispered to the silence. Let her words be enough to mourn the departed. Civilization isn't preserved with compassion and empathy alone, but rather with the sacrifice of the men within the boundaries of its grace, and the price they are willing to pay at the cost of their own soul. After saying this, Bruno stood up and left his office behind, turning off the light before shutting its door. as if trying to escape a haunting spirit that came with the cash and did not fully disperse with its departure. Chapter 444: The Cathedral of Light. Industry had come to Germany at a rate faster than ever before perceived possible by even the greatest of economists around the globe. And the reason for that was simple. Bruno had done the unthinkable and brought forth future knowledge of how the world would one day come to work, and spent decades laying the foundations for it across the Reich. But something else had changed with it. Since Nikola Tesla's theories were proven true and functional, the city of Innsbruck, which was now the capital of the Grand Principality of Tyrol, had been under reconstruction. Why was this the case? It was because it needed to be rebuilt in a way that still respected the heritage and culture of the region, but also with regards to the new future Bruno and Tesla had created together. The first major resonance tower had been constructed within the grand spire of Bruno's Baroque palace. Once meant to house nothing but bells and a cross, now cradled by something stranger, a humming metal obelisk, alive with unseen power. It was still classically beautiful. Austro-German craftsmanship, arched facades, gargoyles, wrought balconies of imperial pride. But from the crown of the palace rose a gleaming framework of brushed steel and brass, humming like it was alive. The world expected the future to rise from glass towers. Instead, it bloomed from limestone, marble, and sovereign will. It was not the era of solar-powered reinforced concrete and glass skyscrapers. No, the future of this world was a synthesis of what had been and what could be if humanity was not guided by petty greed. And so too had the city of Innsbruck begun reconstruction, a city of light, in the darkness of the world, a living, breathing entity of power. While smoke and smog filled the air of the world's other greatest capitals, Innsbruck alone was clean and gleaming, a testament to a future beyond the foolishness of human nature and recklessness. Since Bruno first came to assume his position as the Grand Prince of Tyrol, the city had immediately begun renovation in a way that allowed free, eternal, and clean power to spread throughout its borders, with the goal of eventually powering every home, every building, and every vehicle. Streetlights become a functional blend of power transmission and illumination during the night, becoming pylons and nodes for the resonance tower to reach out to and kiss with its invisible electricity. And the stoplights, invented with the perfection of traffic control in mind, now operated in much the same manner. If there was a place that could blend function with power transference, it was in the act of being retrofitted here and now as the 1920s slowly crept up on the world from afar. Meanwhile, the roads and the very earth beneath the buildings were altered in a way that allowed for power to emanate from within. Redundancies were either currently in place or in the process of being constructed on a citywide scale. This included the likes of diesel-electric generators, backup battery installations, etc., to ensure that even if something were to occur to the resonance tower and its nodes, electricity would still function as intended within the city. Bruno walked through the gardens of his estate, where flowers and trees were beginning to fade as autumn once more claimed their beauty so that winter may not steal their soul, was personal witness to these changes. The spire illuminated as the sun began to set, a beacon of hope, casting sacred light upon the city below, and Bruno could not help but admire its beauty. He was not alone in this regard. Heidi gazed upon it, equally in awe and fear at what it could mean. Are you sure there won't be any problems with having this thing built into the structure of our home? I don't want to be the one to say I told you so, but if this turns to disaster in the years to come, I will be the first to remind you. Bruno chuckled as he pulled his wife in tightly, and assured her they weren't dealing with a toxic or radioactive substance like asbestos or radium, but rather pure and clean energy. Naturally, it was safely embedded into their palace in a way that would neither disturb their peace nor their health. You know, if I didn't know any better, I would say your pessimistic outlook on such beauty was greater than my own. But you are right to question this very real fear. Luckily for you, you married a man who has already thought about such things and prepared for every possible contingency. No, my dear, you need not worry about this tower affecting our home, our family, or our lives in any negative way. This is not some grim omen waiting to reap our souls. This is a beacon of light that keeps the demons at bay. This is our future as a family, as a nation, and as a world, and we are looking at the first true functional display of this. Heidi's distressed gaze faded as she nuzzled her head into her man's shoulder with a gentle expression on her loving face, accepting his arm around her shoulder as she looked up at him and remembered something that had occurred not long in the past, something she couldn't help but bring up. So then, why were you, your architects, city planners, and engineers squabbling over this damn thing if it's not a danger to us or anyone else? Bruno looked down at his wife and smirked before informing her that such a discussion was not a thing she needed to worry herself about. That was a discussion between artists and engineers about whether practicality or aesthetics should be the principal factor in the tower's design and location. As much as I understand the utilitarian principles espoused by the engineers who made this tower possible, they forgot we built cathedrals not just for gods, but for dreams. And this is my cathedral. Heidi heard Bruno's words and thought silently as she gazed upon the ground spire, providing almost heavenly light upon the palace grounds and the immediate vicinities while standing higher than any other building in the city, as the palace itself was built in a strategic location in the hills above the rest, a statement of its sovereign's majesty and militaristic lineage. When she gazed down on the lights of the city in the distance below and back up at the tower, Heidi couldn't help but giggle as she realized just how much Bruno's words, while poetic in nature, matched the reality he had created. She then leaned in close and whispered something in Bruno's ears that only the two of them would hear. If this is your cathedral, then you must be its priest? Does that make me a nun? If so, Father, I have a few sins I will need to confess, privately, in our room. Bruno stared at Heidi's seductive expression and hit her with the greatest response he could muster. Woman, you're not a nun, you're a damn temptress. And may God have mercy on my soul for the sins that I am about to commit with you. After saying that, Bruno picked his wife up in a style befitting of her royal status as princess and carried her to their bedroom throughout the incomplete palace and its interior. They would not re-emerge until the resonance tower dimmed beneath the pale gold of morning light and its new dawn. Chapter 445, The Pageantry of Peace. The Olympic Games and Germany's domination within them had an equally resounding effect across the world, as their overwhelming victory during the Great War had been 2 years prior. Germany was no longer just a highly militarized industrial state. No, it was an empire who reigned supreme and sovereign during times of war and peace alike. And those athletes who gained their medals, regardless of what tint they were made of, they were paraded as national heroes. If soldiers and generals like Bruno were heralded as the men who defended the fatherland from the barbarians at the gates, then these athletes were lauded with the prestige and affection reserved for those cultural guardians. Radio interviews, newspaper advertisements, propaganda leaflets distributed across the city, the men and women who had brought home the gold, the silver, and the bronze for nearly every competition were plastered everywhere. Profit was to be made off of their prowess. And make no mistake, these athletes were buying into it, within legal grounds, of course. Nevertheless, the most talked about athletes were Germany's boxers, kickboxers, and wrestlers. Sure, the fencer, archers, and marksmen had their highlight as well above the other non-combat related sports. But few could forget the way Germany's sons had battered and bruised the competition with not just sheer brutality and resilience, but elegance and precision. These were men who stood in front of their opponents and remained completely unable to be hit, while throwing their own weapons right back in a way that was damn near imperceptible to the men they were fighting. It was a testament of evolution, not only of the body and mind of these fighters, but of their style and technique. In 1918, boxing and wrestling were crude, inefficient, brawlers throwing bare gloves hands at each other, seeing who was left standing at the end. But Germany's combat sports program? That was Bruno's brainchild, and the modern world hadn't seen anything like it. The sport had metamorphosed from its initial barbaric form, which resembled Lethwei, when Bruno introduced it in the 1900s, to a fully modern K1 style rule set, which required athletes to wear protection in the forms of properly sized and rated gloves, mouthguards, and cups. Kickboxing was heavily highlighted in the press. The modern version of the sport, the one integrated into the 1918 Olympics, was an invention of Germany, and its fighters were a particularly fearsome archetype of the infamous Dutch style from Bruno's past life. lining up powerful low kicks and body kicks with their hands, while always searching for an aggressive knockout with their upper body. It had devastated the competition, of which only those fighters from Thailand really had an answer. And even then, the traditional Thai rules were restricted by the lack of elbows and heavy clinch fighting that the Olympic Committee had prohibited. Currently, the gold medalists of the different kickboxing weight classes were posing for photos with powerful figures from the German Reich, the three primary of which were Wilhelm, Bruno, and Franz Joseph, each of which were dressed in civilian attire, but with their greatest medals earned pinned to their chests. Despite having created a new order of chivalry for the Grand Principality of Tyrol and its most deserved citizens, Bruno did not award himself with the Order of the Tyrolean Lion. It was an order whose identity was based upon the new moniker he had been granted by friends and rivals alike after he was granted dominion over Tyrol. Bruno felt that only the medals he had been granted by those above him, for deeds he performed in battle, mattered. And thus, despite no longer being a Hungarian nobleman, he still proudly wore the sash and chain of office of the Royal Order of St. Stephen of Hungary, of which he was still technically the Grand Master of. It paired nicely with both his German military uniform and his expertly tailored tailcoat for civilian gatherings such as this. When Bruno posed for photographs with the gold medalists of the German Reich, he couldn't help but hear one of them whisper to him in between the shots, "You know, my brother owes you his life. He says the only reason he is alive right now is because in Italy you gave him the rest he needed to actively keep his wits about him the next day when the Italians charged his position. And he says you did it by taking his spot on watch for the night. I should be giving you this medal right now as thanks." Bruno smiled for the cameras as he shook the man's hand, before telling him in between the flashes how he felt. "I did what any leader ought to do in the field of battle. I looked after the men under me, as if they were my own sons. And because I was fulfilling my duty to them as their commander, I need no special thanks. That medal is as yours by right of merit, as this sash is mine. And you should not be so willing to give away the fruits of your excellence, not as a gratitude, not for monetary compensation, and sure as hell not for the love of a woman, unless the alternative is destitution or ruin. Be proud of what you accomplished for yourself, your family, and your nation. And say nothing more, because your brother and I did the same in Italy, and I doubt he would want you to give away that which you have earned himself on his behalf. Now, how about after these damned festivities for the sake of the cameras are over, you call up your brother and the three of us to have a drink together? I would very much like to know what he is up to now that the war is over, and his life is his again." The kickboxer was stunned beyond words by what Bruno had said, and by the way he expressed his dreads towards the spotlight granted toward them, and the offer given afterward. He could tell Bruno wasn't being polite for publicity's sake, but was genuinely offering a chance to drink together as equals. It was so absurd, he dared not believe it. But even so, he deeply desired to burden Bruno with his acceptance, and because of this, he was about to say yes when Bruno made it official for the man so that he wouldn't have to. "It's settled then. Come find me after these vultures have buzzed off, and I'll take you to a place with history. I'm sure you and your brother will enjoy it." After this, Bruno walked off, leaving the athlete in complete and total disarray. It would not be until later when he called his older brother and told him what happened that he realized Bruno was not bluffing in the slightest and was indeed waiting for his return once the propaganda had been concluded for the day. Chapter 446, Old Dogs, Cold Beer. Bruno had exited the venue of the media presentation almost immediately after it was finished, returning to his estate in Berlin, which was now his home away from home. There he quickly stripped himself out of his overly formal attire and returned to more comfortable clothes, less lavish, and more cozy in style, like a working father going out to the pub with the boys after a hard shift. Having concluded this ritualistic act, Bruno took a car to an old establishment which held a special place in his heart. Back in the day, he, Eric, and Heinrich used to sneak out of the academy barracks to come here, drink in hand, dreams in their eyes. But that future had been dimmed by the blood, mud, and grime of war. Eric was gone now, and Heinrich? Well, he and Bruno were so busy with their respective roles in society, they seldom gathered anymore. Sure, Heinrich was still Bruno's subordinate in the military hierarchy, but the man was actually busy looking after the army group he was in charge of, while Bruno had transcended his position and entered the position on par with Joint Chief of the General Staff like the Americans had in Bruno's past life. Even so, this bar, it was a place that Bruno and Heinrich alike still cherished and had opted to meet together at. As Bruno waited for Heinrich to arrive, as well as the two brothers he had invited, he noticed that time had a way of truly changing the world around him. The familiar faces of those past patrons Bruno had once conversed with were long gone, and in time so too had the bartenders who poured him his beer in the golden days been replaced with younger and more vibrant minds. Even so, there was always something about this place that never truly aged. He could visit it 100 years from now, and the spirit would hopefully still remain the same. Heinrich was the first to take a seat next to Bruno, and the difference between the two of them was staggering. Though roughly the same age, and both of elite and wealthy status, Bruno easily looked 10 years younger than his close friend. His genetics had hid his age with grace, whereas Heinrich actually looked like many rapidly approaching his 40th year. In addition to that, Bruno looked like he was a young farmhand or factory worker having just gotten off the clock and appeared at the local tavern for a soothing beer and a chat with the mates. Heinrich looked like the kind of man who owned the company Bruno might have worked for in another life. Elegantly dressed in a lavish suit, and his hair groomed to perfection, gray streaks along its locks, whereas Bruno's own tuft of gold was devoid of any such imperfections. Heinrich couldn't help but sigh and shake his head as he commented on his best friend's damn, near-timeless face. "Brother, how is it that you look almost as young as my daughter? And I look like a man who has been through the meat grinder." Bruno lifted a liter of beer and handed it off to Heinrich, a smug smirk on his face, as he spoke the taunt that damn near made his friend choke on his own drink. "I would suppose you could say my genes are stronger than yours. I suppose I have my mother to thank for that. Somehow we all managed to get that graceful aging, and a face that defies Kronos' curse." Heinrich stared at Bruno with a discerning gaze before posing a question that had a reciprocal effect on the man, as he too damn near suffocated as he began to cough up his beer. "Does that mean that you and Heidi are related? She too appears to bewitch in the same way as your own family. And while I know about her father and his side of the family, what of her mother? Do you know who her parents were?" Bruno stared at his old friend with a murderous gaze, as if he was going to wear his guts for garters if he dared speak another word of such heresy. And the man was about to verbally confirm this when the two brothers arrived, only one of which was dressed as casual as him. The man who was dressed like a common dockyard hand was quick to salute Bruno in the fashion of a proper soldier. "Sir, I am pleased to see you are as healthy as ever. My name is—" Bruno was quick to cut the younger man off as he responded with a triumphant smirk on his own face. "I know who you are, Corporal. No, I should say Sergeant Price, was it? You were promoted shortly before the march to Paris, weren't you, lad? And earned an Iron Cross, no less. Well done. I wish I could have been there to pin it to your chest myself." Heinrich took one look at the young man and his even younger brother and was quick to realize something. "Wait a second. I was the one who gave you the medal, wasn't I?" The young veteran was surprised to see that these two myths among men had remembered him, and was quick to ask, with an almost pessimistic tone, the way soldiers do to one another, and especially veterans no longer bound by hierarchy or rank. "There's no fucking way you both remember a grunt like me." Heinrich had a shit-eating grin as he drank from his mug before talking to Bruno, as if the ruse had been seen through. "I do believe the boy has caught us in our lie." Bruno, however, shook his head and chuckled. "Boy, this lad fought and bled like the rest of us. That makes him more man than anyone who's only read about Isonzo in the papers. And Heinrich is right. We're just messing with you. I looked up your file after speaking with your brother, and I presume he did the same after I told him about tonight's affairs. No hard feelings, right?" The kickboxer looked at his older brother, thinking the man would perhaps break at the idea of his idols forgetting all about him and playing a cruel prank. But the veteran surprised his younger brother as he shook Bruno's hand and joined him for the laugh. "I'll admit, you had me there for a second. It truly was the honor of my life to serve beneath the two of you. So if you don't mind me asking, what the hell have you both been up to over the last 2 years?" And just like that, the four of them sat down and shared stories of the years when peace had settled, of their time in the trenches, and of what came before. It was a brief night, one where Bruno and Heinrich had met together and met with two of their former comrades, and in doing so, just let themselves be free until the dawn came to claim them once more. Chapter 447, Plausible Deniability. The United States Congress was currently embroiled in turmoil over the southern border and the ongoing Mexican Revolution. Reports showed that men armed with old Winchester rifles had left a trail of blood and bodies in their wake. And if these rumors were to be true, they appeared oddly organized and trained, better than even the remnants of the old Federal Army. Their equipment was lightweight, capable of being moved rapidly via horseback, and was ideal for the terrain they were fighting in. They carried repeating rifles chambered in modern calibers, and revolvers suspiciously similar to current-issue U.S. designs. Their arsenals also included heavy machine guns lifted straight from old German blueprints, lightweight man-portable mortars, proven in the Great War, and finally lightweight and rapid-firing 75mm field guns that oddly enough looked like sanitized and modernized German 7.5cm FK-16 Na. It would appear this was a force armed by both the Americans and the Germans alike, and these men were waging total war against every other faction in the chaos south of America's borders. As for the American Congress, they desperately wanted to know who had given the approval to sell U.S.-manufactured weapons to these violent guerrillas. The reality was that the weapons were sold in a way that was completely deniable from the Winchester Company. Their markings were scrubbed, if even added in the first place, and were chambered in a caliber Winchester had never produced before, but had also been given a more military aesthetic which otherwise didn't exist in this timeline. So their response as a company when summoned by the court to answer for this very clear violation of ethics and potential criminal act was to claim ignorance and state it was possible Germany or some other nation managed to reverse engineer Browning's old designs which had been sold under their banner and were given by said unknown actors to the Mexican guerrillas. But Germany also claimed ignorance. Of course, the reality was that Winchester was lying, and the German nation was genuinely unaware of the agreement between Bruno and the president, conducted entirely through back-channel diplomacy. And because of this, nobody really knew who was selling these weapons to this new and terrifying force which was claiming to be fighting not for gods, kings, or country, but to restore order to an otherwise lawless hellscape. Thus, Congress could only shout and squabble as the president used his authority to move US troops to the southern border to prevent more senseless violence from revolutionaries like Pancho Villa, whom he suspected was already in retreat. Order from Washington had come down in secrecy to the Sons of Liberty to capture, torture, and execute Pancho Villa, making a spectacle of his end as a message to others like him. This was the fate of those who dared to intrude upon the lands of the red, white, and blue. Of course, these orders could have been deliberately mistranslated by the Germans who relayed them, as the presidency's only real way of giving out these orders to his Mexican proxies was first through secured communications with Bruno, who would then pass them along to the werewolf group operatives in the area acting as trainers and liaisons to this force of armed combatants forged beneath their tutelage. Which meant that only Bruno and the president truly knew the hand that guided the chaos. Hence why, at that very moment, the leader of the Sons of Liberty stood smoking a cigarillo, watching as his soldiers utilized their rapid-fire 75mm field artillery to batter the hiding place where their target was suspected of residing. Shots rang out from the trenches, aimed at the riflemen clinging to the crumbling walls of the stronghold. It was almost as if these poor bastards didn't get the memo that fixed fortifications were a thing of the past. They were a hell of a lot more expensive to build, and so much more so when they needed to be repaired after suffering from mortar and artillery fire like they were currently being bombarded with. Meanwhile, the earthen fortifications used by the Sons of Liberty who had surrounded the stronghold were far cheaper to repair, and often did so themselves as dirt was launched vertically and horizontally by the enemy shells fired at them, while sandbags split, gaps in trenches sealed themselves with the mud left behind by rain. Whereas the old stone and concrete walls of the enemy shattered, crumbled, and were eventually worn to ruin as the exchange continued for hours on end. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of heated battle, the werewolf attaché approached the leader of the Sons of Liberty and gave him an order in flawless Spanish. The enemy hasn't returned fire in over 30 minutes. I suspect that they have run low on shells. Send a small contingent to test their resolve in a coordinated assault. If they do not return fire with heavier firepower than mere machine guns, that means the time to push forward and seize victory has come. Colonel Olivares looked over at the German with his dark eyes, which were the only major feature of his identity that escaped beyond the boundaries of the skull bandana tied to his face. His voice was less than ecstatic as he shared his thoughts. It would be a lot easier if we had some armored cars, or God forbid tanks of our own to conduct the assault. Fewer of my men would need to bleed and die. The German officer responded not with indifference, but with an empathetic tone as he pulled the Mexican colonel aside and told him why that wasn't feasible. I understand your sympathies, I truly do. The Reich is currently sitting on a stockpile of old armored vehicles that are rapidly being replaced from service in the Standard Army and are being sold to our group for a fraction of the price it took to make them. But there is one major problem with this little plan of yours. So, allow me to put this bluntly. If armored cars and tanks end up on this battlefield of yours, then the ability for both the United States and Germany to maintain deniability will vanish with their appearance. And if that were to happen, then the United States will have no choice but to personally send their army south. Now, if the Americans were to invade Mexico in full force, why would they ever need you and your hardy band of guerrillas? So your two options are this: total annihilation by the U.S. Army and full-scale annexation, or a bloody assault that ends in independence. Which will it be, Colonel? Not another word needed to be said, because Colonel Olivares knew that what his German advisor had said was precisely the outcome that would occur if German armor ended up on Mexican soil. And thus he ordered the assault, hoping to capture Pancho Villa and do as his American handlers in Washington had tasked him with in secrecy. Chapter 448, The Illusion of Parity. The initial concepts of the Panzer II, built upon the E-25 chassis, had proved to be effective, and in the years since they first crossed past the Alps and into Austria as the bulwark in stabilization efforts, improvements had been made to the overall platform, and the chassis had now been perfected in a way for mass production. And naturally, that meant that experimentation with full-scale combined arms integration of the platform had also begun production in Germany. But as always, the world was watching what Germany was producing, just beginning to understand their failures during the Great War, and was now trying their best to produce machines that could keep up. Interestingly enough, on English soil, the Mk3 tank had begun to see its prototyping complete. It was no longer a crude misunderstanding of the Panzer I, but a similar design overall. Boasting a simplified suspension, albeit not to the level of the torsion bar used on the Panzer I and II in this timeline. The low-height, sloped armored tank mounted with a QF 2-pounder main gun on a rotating turret that was less than ideal when compared to those mounted on German tanks. The 2 pounds, or 40 mm main gun was subpar when compared with the 50 mm gun on the German Panzer I, and its ammo was not quite as advanced, but for a tank manufactured in 1918, it was well above and beyond its competition during Bruno's past life. There was a reason for this. After all, German advancement had outpaced their competition, and their rivals who were defeated and forced to prepare for the future were desperately trying to copy the Reich's homework. And this was not the only weapons platform Britain was trying desperately to pump out after more or less having unquelled the majority of unrest across their empire's borders, or what was left of them after the Great War had come to a close in their defeat. Biplanes with aluminum fuselages, wings, and propellers entered British service. Primitive attempts at imitating the German P-51. Even so, to say the plane managed to mimic the Gloucester Gladiator from Bruno's past life was a fairly accurate assessment of the prototype, at least in terms of outward appearance. Practically speaking, its powertrain was still lacking, while Britain and other major players like Italy and those watching overseas in the lands of the United States might be able to mimic Germany's homework in structural innovation. When it came to producing engines capable of matching said performance, they were woefully behind the times. So, this was a flying aluminum wood hybrid coffin, and only so because it was operating with a World War I-era Hispano-Suiza 8F that produced a mere 330 horsepower and was designed to carry wood and canvas planes into the air, not aluminum. Quite honestly, semi-aluminum construction biplane, with synchronized Vickers, and a speed of a little over 100 miles per hour, this would have been the most advanced plane on the planet in 1918 of Bruno's past life. But the Germans were already fielding He-51s en masse, of multiple variations to perform every role it currently needed to fulfill in the German Air Force. In addition to this, Bf-109s were in pre-production prototype variants, soon to replace these already obsolete fighter planes, which would be relegated to reserve service, training new pilots, and export to more minor nations like Greece and Hungary. It was truly a testament to just how much ahead of the world Germany had become under Bruno's guiding hand. Thus, weeks later, when photographs and film taken by German intelligence agents in Britain of their new prototype fighter made their way to Bruno's desk at the office of the General Staff, he alone sat there inspecting the film footage and the still pictures, taking in what he was seeing take flight for the first time. Meanwhile, the Air Force generals and naval grand admirals who also sat by his side for this intelligence report had an entirely different approach to the briefing they were receiving. The first response from the others who stood in the room was to jeer and mock the British Empire in their vain attempts to catch up. These were petty comments made by short-sighted men who sat on the laurels of Germany's previous victory, and overall technological dominance was to be expected, as they didn't understand who was truly behind the reason why Germany was so advanced compared to the rest of the world. That thing appears more like a glider than it does a plane. Is that supposed to be our competition? What did they trade speed for metal? Do they think it's the aluminum that saved our pilots from their flak? Bruno did not immediately respond to the question. In fact, he was quiet as the insults continued to fly through the room faster than the Gladiator prototype would ever be capable of. Instead, Bruno's words shook the room into silence when they were spoken. It's truly impressive how far the British have come, without direct access to the He-51's blueprints, and just a few pictures and stories taken during the war to go off of. They must have some very talented minds working for them to pull this off in a mere 2 years of development. It's a pity it won't matter. The He-51 already outperforms it. But the more they begin to understand this prototype of theirs, what works, and what doesn't, the faster they will develop something better. We should increase intelligence activity within the British Isles, as I want to keep an eye on their future products. The Air Force generals remained utterly silent as the intelligence agent conducting the briefing pushed to the next slide to show their new tank. He felt a bit awkward asking what immediately came to mind, but felt compelled to do so. And what of the new Mk3 tank design? Bruno gazed upon it for a few minutes before giving his honest thoughts. A vast improvement, thicker armor that appears welded instead of riveted, a true sloped shape hull, a better gun, and a more functional turret. Could it go 1-to-1 and emerge victorious against a Panzer I? Perhaps a 10% chance if I'm being generous, but still a remarkable attempt. Britain is advancing quicker than I thought they would, and we would do well to increase counter-espionage and begin psychological operations to trick them into thinking our development is heading in other, less practical directions. If they were to have a functional idea of the Panzer II, it would not be good for us. Luckily for us, only whispers exist of it, as anyone who actually saw it and lived to tell the tale would not be in a mental state to be believed. Bruno's words were once more challenging the arrogance of those who sought to rest on the victory he had created for them. But Bruno was not the type of man to let victory and technological superiority to create a mindset of complacency, and because of this, after he took a sip from his glass of water that sat on his desk, he looked over at the Air Force general who had dared to mock the British prototype fighter and said the most devastating words to him he had never expected. By the way, if you can't perceive the danger this plane represents, then you are unfit to lead the Luftstreitkräfte going forward. I want your General Feldmarschall collar and shoulder tabs on my desk by tomorrow morning. If not, I will have them removed by force. There was no protest that erupted after hearing Bruno, the man who was technically the Joint Chief of Staff, and in command of all military units above all others except for the Kaiser himself, strip the man of his rank and kick him down a peg on the hierarchy, because after Bruno had spoken, they all understood what the man had done wrong, and how such a mentality could lead to ruin, eventually. Contrary to what anyone was expecting, however, the man himself, who had been demoted, did not protest either, nor throw a fit. He simply bowed his head and admitted fault as he tore off his insignia then and there and handed them over to Bruno while maintaining a deep bow of respect. You are right. I have proven unworthy of this prestigious rank that you had previously entrusted me with. I will seek to reclaim them when I have earned them rightfully again. I will remember this lesson you have taught me today for the rest of my life." Bruno's waning confirmation that the correct lesson had been learned was quick to raise his brow in suspicion as he demanded an answer in front of all the others so that they could know his intent, too. And what might that lesson be? The Air Force general still did not raise his head as his voice contained pure resolve, as he spoke every word with the conviction of a man who had seen hell and determined never to walk its path again. We should never underestimate our enemies, no matter how powerful and advanced we may perceive ourselves to be. Bruno grabbed hold of the General Feldmarschall insignia that the other man had worn moments before and pocketed them with an approving smile on his face, assuring the man the path to redemption had truly begun. "You will get these back when I am sure the lesson has stuck. As for the rest of you, you would do well to remember these words as well. Victory has defeated more great men and the empires they have built than defeat ever has, and if left unchecked, will be our undoing as well." With that, Bruno looked at his watch and noticed it was time for another appointment, a far more personal one which he had promised someone far more important than these generals, which he was quick to make a light-hearted remark about, as if it were only natural for him to do so. "Now, that will be all for today, gentlemen. I promised my wife we would be having tea at noon, and the time for my departure has arrived." Nobody dared complain about Bruno meeting with his wife at their old estate during work hours, especially if it was a lunch break. He was after all the man who had earned them victory, and if anyone deserved a bit of flexibility in his work schedule, it was him. Chapter 449, The Devil and the Architect. Hungary was a kingdom that had not been the same since the Great War ended, and that was to be expected. Once united with Austria as a great power of the world, it had suddenly found itself alone, left to fight civil wars within its former territories. Austria had faced the same collapse, but they had the power of the werewolf group backing them, allowing a swift return to law and order, and a seamless annexation into the German Reich, where its vast wealth was used to help rebuild the country and heal the scars that had nearly torn it apart. Hungary was not so lucky. Suffering from all the same ills as Austria coming out of the Great War, it had no savior, no liberator. And its king? His solution to a growing number of problems was to utilize what remained of his army to suppress violence, crime, dissent, and illness. Whether of the addiction variety, the mental kind, or perhaps even those who were spiritually ill, when one was drowning and the only branch to save themselves with was the barrel of a gun, it was an option better than simply giving up and accepting your end. And so the Hungarian army marched. Powerful? That was relative. Most of Austro-Hungary's armored vehicles had ended up in the hands of the German army after the Archduchy of Austria joined hands with their German brothers. Hungary was left with a mixture of surplus rifles, primarily chambered in 8x57mm Mauser, water-cooled machine guns, field artillery dragged by horses, armor, trucks. These were relics, scarred, rusting things, used more as mobile shields and makeshift gun platforms against entrenched infantry than for any true doctrine of armored warfare. Air support? Virtually non-existent. The Austro-Hungarian wood and canvas planes were easily shot out of the sky by superior German flak guns, ironically left behind after their sale to the KUK before the collapse of the dual monarchy. No, these men needed help. Help maintaining order, suppressing ethnic revolts, advancing the goals of Greater Hungary. A new map sat on the Hungarian king's desk. King Ars of Hungary, a general of the Great War who, during a time of anarchy, had crowned himself when no other option was available. And now, there was little more he could do but gaze upon the borders laid out before him. His uniform was regal and tidy, the crystal glass in his hand filled with the finest port wine brought in through river channels from the shores of Portugal itself. He looked less like a general and more like a king masquerading as one, despite clearly having earned the medals pinned to his chest. Even so, the map was new. The world had changed in the wake of the Great War, and so too were the lines on it redrawn. Germany was greater and more united than ever. Lost territories, or those who had simply refused to yield out of stubbornness to the Hohenzollerns, finally reclaimed. But Hungary? It was smaller than ever, feebler, barely held together by the will of a sovereign, and the men who had called him king when all others had abandoned them in their hour of need. Sure, it wasn't as dire as the Treaty of Trianon had been in Bruno's past life, brutally so, but in this world, here and now, it was a disgraceful thing for a man to look at. Sacrifices had already been made by Ars and his people. In his attempt to secure his homeland in Transylvania, he had given up the very town he was born and raised in. Part of the three-way partition Bruno imposed at the edge of a blade, or at the very least, a threat of its use. But at the very least, he had secured part of the region, the Hungarian part, and that created a buffer, for the time being, against the Romanians and the threats that lay beyond. But now, everything he had was already threatening to fall apart. For every fire he put out, two more burned somewhere else. It was a never-ending effort of futility and blood, and he didn't know if Hungary could continue to bear the cost. By his side stood one of his generals, a man who had stood with him through the Great War and was ready to do so still. The man seemed to know exactly what his king was thinking and was quick to suggest a plan he knew was a long shot. You know, we could do what the Habsburgs did. Hire those mercenaries the Grand Prince of Tyrol claims aren't his personal private army. It would certainly be an enormous aid in dealing with the rebels and brigands outside the safety of Budapest. King Ars seemed almost offended by the remark, because he knew, all too well, what few others had come to understand. When Bruno offered you aid, it always came with a price, one almost unbearable to pay. And when Ars thought of how Bruno had manipulated the Habsburgs into selling their souls to him, then claimed it in a way that left Germany stronger, but Hungary defenseless and abandoned, he couldn't help but tense his grip around his glass, to the point that small cracks began to appear within its surface, but not deep enough to spill the red liquid within. His voice sounded as if it were just barely passing through his pursed lips as he gave his reply in a forcefully restrained manner. Never in a million years would I call in such a favor. Don't get me wrong. I will never march our forces to reclaim my hometown. The moment Bruno made it clear it was bound by Germany's protection, I realized these borders with Romania were forever sealed. But I will not request aid from him either. To do so would be to damn us all, just as he has done to the Habsburgs. You weren't there, not in Sarajevo, when we were putting down those guerrillas that popped up in the war. The man has the brutality of the devil, of Satan himself, but the charm of Lucifer. With a silver tongue, he will whisper sweet poison into your ear, so tempting you can't help but take a sip, and before you know it, you've consumed the whole carton. And only he has the antidote. And yet, he never calls in these favors for lust, or drink, or gold, or power, or prestige, only for those he serves. He's an anomaly, an aberration, something that should never have been, but who wields the power to bend kings and emperors before him like dogs currying favor with their master. I have never met a man so forward-thinking, so visionary, yet still so rooted in tradition and respect for what came before. And even so, more than willing to throw all of that away if it gets in the way of the world he's trying to build. When Wilhelm is gone, when Franz Joseph is dead, and Nicholas has kicked the bucket, who will truly wear the crown of crowns within Germany? Who will be the real emperor? It was a jarring question, and an even more shocking revelation, that Bruno was the reason the Habsburgs, after centuries of political ties and brotherhood with Hungary, had abandoned it entirely. Something the Hungarian nationalists, and maybe even the world, had not truly seen when Franz Joseph signed the document that saw Austria join Germany once and for all. As for Bruno, he was not some mythical figure descending from the heavens, bathed in moonlight and whispering in your ear with the voice of a siren, tempting you into a Faustian bargain. Oh, quite the contrary. He was a man building what he believed was a better world, one with purpose and order. And he was quite literally doing just that now, across the Danube, into the Alps. Progress on his palace and its grounds had gone well in the time since he'd claimed a home in Tyrol. And even now, he was not simply directing the project, he was adding to it, personally. As the scaffolding was erected on a new wing of the palace, opulent, yet fortified, Bruno was riveting a galvanized steel beam in place alongside the work crew. In fact, he had fetched his younger son Joseph to help hold the beam steady. Joseph had grown enough over the years to assist his father with daily tasks like this. And despite being second in line to a dynastic title of prince, he was dressed in work clothes, hands greasy, performing manual labor just like his father. Joseph had followed in Erwin's steps, despite being half a decade younger. A childhood filled with discipline and humility. Sure, Their home was grander than the one Erwin had grown up in, but from the day he was born, the boy knew no pampering. His privilege, like Erwin's, was the dirt beneath his feet, and he was expected to help around the house, just like his brothers and sisters. Servants weren't to be bullied, mistreated, or disrespected like slaves. If a moment came where one of Bruno's children was in a position to help, especially in their youth, they were expected to do so. And so, after Bruno used the pneumatic rivet gun in his hand to secure the beam, he offered his son a proud smile. "I'm proud of you, son. You and I did a beautiful job on this one. Right to spec. Now, just another 100 more before we call it quits for the day." Contrary to what one might expect from a boy born into the status of a second prince, Joseph was not exhausted, dismissive, or frustrated. He seemed almost excited to be helping his war hero of a father build their new family home, beam by beam, bolt by bolt. Even if it was a grand palace. Even if it was meant to house generations of princes. Sure, let's do it. Chapter 450, The Weight of Lines. The smoking chamber of a bolt-action rifle as it ejected a spent brass case, one of too many to count, filled the air, as a man in low-ranked military uniform ensured another round was seated before aiming down the weapon in his hand and squeezing the trigger again. Squeezing wasn't quite the right word. Panic, adrenaline, and excitement flooded the bloodstream as bullets whipped past his body and shredded the men behind him. The sanguine liquid of life now ripped from its grace and future poured out on the dirt beneath their freshly rotting corpse, something barely worth mentioning. Such a scene was common, far too tiresome to even think about in the Balkans. Especially here, and now in the interwar era. Yet the young man, the boy really, hardly even an adult, perhaps even younger than one would expect by the age on his face, fired another thunderous shot downrange towards the machine gun nest and the men within it who had killed his comrade just moments before. The language he spoke was old, changed in time into something new, modern, but whose roots were ancient. He was a Serbian boy who had witnessed Bruno's march through his lands just 2 years prior. But then he was young, younger than now, not yet old enough to pick up a rifle and defend his home, avenge his father and brothers, some of which were choked to death in the miasma of gas that suffocated Belgrade into extinction, and the soldiers defending its heritage. But this was a new year, a new Serbia, a new army, and most importantly, a new capital. Ironically, the city itself, the buildings within it were more damaged now than they had been in Bruno's diabolical vengeance against the Black Hand. Evil had been committed here, then, now, and long before anyone alive today had ever drawn their first breath. It was the nature of life, the nature of the Balkans, the nature of humanity. And so, too, men and boys struggled, with arms in their hand, for family, God, king, and country as they killed in the name of all the above, and to protect what was behind them. Finally, as the boy splattered the brains of the machine gunner, he rushed into the nest, bayonet affixed, and thrust the steel that lay at the end of his rifle straight into the heart of the loader. The man he killed was easily twice his age, and wearing a Croatian uniform, a shared history, heritage, and linguistic roots. But a different cross, a different God, a different nation. And so they fought, they bled, and they burned. And his death was just one of many in the name of such fruitless endeavors. Another nameless face in the tides of bodies that had been claimed by war and its cruelty. And the boy who killed him? Not the slightest remorse. No, just fatigue. He was tired, physically, mentally, spiritually, and far too accustomed to the bloodshed at an age that was simply unforgivable for such a sentiment to be learned. Nevertheless, this was his life, and as a soldier of the new Serbian kingdom, he fought furthermore, reloading the weapon with a stripper clip from his load-bearing equipment as another Croatian soldier came rushing in with a revolver in hand, aiming it straight at the boy and pulling the trigger without a second thought. Bang! Lines were drawn on a map in Bruno's war room, which was one of the few completed rooms of his palace as it currently stood. Yesterday's lesson to his son Joseph had been completed without incident, but today was a matter of politics, ethics, and an understanding of the burden that came with the right to rule. The map was one of many. Borders had changed so frequently throughout the last few decades, and they represented more than just lines, but the changing of time, the passing of civilizations, and the rise of empires. Such things need not only be remembered, but the context in which they occurred lest humans, and especially future leaders, be doomed to repeat them. In particular, Bruno was showing Joseph and his younger brothers the reality that was the Balkans. In the last 100 years alone, since the time of Napoleon until now, this region in particular had changed more than any other. And Bruno needed to highlight why this was, and the price that had been paid for the consistent reorganization of these lines. Joseph, not understanding the full weight of what he was looking at, seemed rather elated, innocently, so as he mentioned his thoughts to his father, that did not immediately provoke a thought. Do all nations change so frequently throughout history, father? Bruno thought long and hard about this question for longer than he should have before finally shaking his head and sighing. No, at least not as frequently as the Balkans, and nor should they. You may not understand this yet at your age, Joseph, but every time these lines are changed, it doesn't just represent the acquisition or concession of a territory or two, and sometimes an entire kingdom or another. No, it represents a loss on a scale of magnitude you cannot even begin to understand. Bruno then went silent, his gaze suddenly becoming glassy, as if he was no longer looking at the map, but well beyond it and the floor beneath it. Joseph couldn't possibly understand what his father was thinking. He barely understood what the man said. He had an inkling, but he was still young enough where the concept of war wasn't something horrific, but rather gallant and chivalric in a way that men should aspire to. No matter what era and nation, boys would always aspire to be a soldier at some point in their life, no, or at least a fair amount of them would. Perhaps because of this innocence and naivety, Joseph made a comment that couldn't help but snap his father back to attention. Loss? Like what resources? Materials? As if, pondering whether he should reveal the truth to his son, Bruno paused silently as he rolled up the map and pulled out the next one, before finally deciding to just go through with his thoughts, albeit filtered and sanitized for a boy Joseph's age that he would properly process. Yes, that too, but I was more alluding to the young men who fight for these changes. You see, Joseph, when a soldier goes to war, more often than not he doesn't come home. He won't live to see his mother, his father, his brothers, his sisters, or if he's old enough, his wife and children. For every time you see these maps change, just know there are a number of headstones somewhere in a graveyard on some country's soil where the ultimate price was paid for what was gained and what was lost. Contrary to what they will teach you in school, my son, war doesn't determine who is right and who is wrong. No, at the end of the day, it only reveals who is left standing when the bullets stop flying. Joseph, as if picking up on the severity of his father's statement and the reality reflected within it, could not help but ask another question. Not one of childhood innocence and ignorance, but rather curiosity in understanding something that he instantly realized was not as glorious or celebratory as he once thought, especially when he envisioned in his mind the ever-increasing graveyards and the headstones within them as the borders changed time and time again between the maps and the years between them. At first, Joseph tried to think it through rationally. Why? What could be worth such a price to be paid? But no matter how he thought about it, he could not find an answer, and in the end he was forced to ask his father for the answer. So, if this is true, why do we fight? Bruno, deciding to end this lecture now that it had become far more grim and somber of a message than he had intended to part upon his son, began to instantly roll up the aging maps and carefully seal them away for future generations of their family to absorb, future lectures to be imparted upon them. And as he did so, he let his tone loose almost as if he was working through the answer to his son's question in his own head. Why do we fight? To ask this is to ask why the leaves fall from the trees in autumn and why they bloom again in the warmth of spring. It is simply in our nature. No, the better question is to ask what is worth fighting for. After saying this, Bruno stashed the containers filled with the large maps away in the family archives, leaving his son stunned into silence. He did not need to ask what was worth fighting for, because as he looked around at this partially finished palace which he and his family were helping to build with their own hands, and his parents and siblings within it, as well as all the laborers who treated him to chocolate and pastries whenever he did a good job, he already knew in his heart the answer: for family and fatherland. What else was worth such a price to be paid?